Is Christianity actually true? And if it is, can it actually be defended by well put together arguments? In today's episode, I'm joined by a Christian philosopher for an apologetics crash course. Apologia meaning a well reasoned defense. We will make a case for God's existence, wrestle honestly with the problem of evil and suffering, and lay out why the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a historically credible event. If you have serious questions about Christianity, this episode is for you. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Javier Perdomo. This channel is a place where we like to do theology videos, church history videos, and Reformation apologetics videos. But as you guys know, we also like to do general Christian apologetics videos, something that I'm wanting to do a lot more of on this channel moving forward. With us today, we have Dr. Nathan Greeley. Dr. Greeley earned a BA in history from Worcester State University before completing an MA and PhD degree in philosophy of religion and theology at Claremont Graduate University. Dr. Greeley is a confessional Lutheran and currently serves as the Fellow of Apologetics and Philosophical Theology for Justin Sinner's Weidner Institute. He's the author of two books, Philosophy and Theology, A Lutheran Perspective, and, much more relevant to today's episode, Christian Apologetics, A Lutheran Introduction, a great book that I would hold up if I had a physical copy, but I read it on EPUB, so it's on my e-reader somewhere. How are you doing, Dr. Greeley?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me on here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, your book is a great introduction to Christian apologetics that I think all Lutherans should pick up, but even someone who is not a Lutheran should be able to pick this up and get a lot out of it. And so I think I left a review like on Goodreads or somewhere on your book where I mentioned that if someone knows literally nothing about how to defend their faith, I think they can pick up your book and actually come away with a pretty good foundation to build on. And so I would highly recommend that to people. And I think hopefully we can give them a little flavor of your book with some of the questions that we have here today. So maybe to start off, how did you personally get interested in Christian apologetics and theology and philosophy and just this whole ordeal?
Well, I was raised in the church, and then in my teenage years, I started to have some doubts about different things and started to ask some questions that I was having difficulty finding good answers to. And I was asking people in my life, what about this? What about that? And the answers I was receiving back, if they, you can even call them answers, were not always compelling. And that caused me to have quite a few doubts. And then I left the church for a while. And then in my mid-20s, I started thinking about my life and what I was doing with it and what the, overarching purpose of it was. And it became clear that I needed to look at Christianity again. I needed to find answers somewhere. And so I did a deep dive into Christianity for several years and was reading all kinds of academic sources and reading in the history of theology, the history of philosophy. And through that process, I did return to the faith, and I returned to an Orthodox biblical perspective. I came to confessional Lutheranism eventually. And so apologetics played a significant role just in working through those doubts and questions that I had acquired when I was a teenager. And then for a long time, didn't really know what to think about or what to say about them. So I worked through those things and got to a point where I was convinced that Christianity is true and has more to recommend it than any other religion or philosophical perspective that's out there.
It's really interesting. I'm sure all of us, especially someone who's watching a video on Christian apologetics like this, whether themselves are wrestling with doubts or know someone who is wrestling with doubt, I want to be able to help them out. It's always interesting and in a lot of cases kind of sad seeing the sort of results of being raised in an environment where people don't know why it is that they believe the things that they believe, right? So, I have a friend, a very close friend, whom I love, who is an atheist, and we talk all the time. And one of the things that he has mentioned to me, because he grew up in a sort of a charismatic environment and this sort of thing. And when he started asking questions, to your point, he wasn't given answers, or really the answers he was given were basically like, hey, you're kind of being disobedient right now. You need to just shut up and sit down. Right.
And he was like, why are you asking?
Why are you asking?
Why are you having these doubts? Like, what's wrong with you type of thing? Yeah.
Yeah, well, and he had, again, very basic questions, like even basic questions regarding things like, I don't know, evolution, the age of the Earth, and it's just people didn't even give him an answer. Like, if memory serves me right, he told me that at one point he asked them like, well, like, how does our worldview, I guess, account for like, fossils and stuff in the ground? And people didn't even know enough to have like a, I don't know, an old Earth versus young Earth conversation, or no, they just told him like fossils were put in the ground by Satan to trick us, and you need to just shut up and stop asking questions, like straight up, right? And so, of course, no wonder, right, for the average person to your, I mean, in your story, it sounds like you said you're very interested in philosophy, and so you started this sort of roundabout way coming back to the faith. But I think for the average person, when they're met with this environment where people are not just uninformed, but they're on top of that, they're kind of aggressive, right? So they're almost like aggressively ignorant. That just kind of signals the wrong thing to the average person, where they say like, well, you know what, if nobody here seems to know what they're talking about, perhaps none of them know what they're talking about, perhaps I shouldn't be a part of this at all, right? And so that's why it's actually
Right.
really important, I think, for people to know how to um, at least have basic conversations, right? Like, not everybody needs to be a PhD in philosophy or a PhD and anything, but I think people need to be equipped at least with the basics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, certainly. I would agree. I mean, that was my experience, when I saw that people didn't have what I considered adequate answers, that definitely turned me off, that made me think that this was really just a house of cards. There was nothing here, nothing, there was nothing substantive here. There was nothing that I could really rest on. There was nothing that I could, take a strong stance on, because there wasn't a foundation for the truth of this perspective or this religion, that I had grown up with. So, and that was, it was something that was difficult for me at the time. I also, there was a part of me that also just wanted to fit in with the kids at school and stuff. So that was also an influence. I was being drawn away through worldly influences too at the time. So I'm not going to act like it was just the church's fault that I left, but the fact that when I went to them with these problems or with these difficulties and I wasn't given good answers, that definitely kind of pushed me out the door even faster. I think that if I had like a mentor, or if I had somebody that could come alongside me and answer these questions, or at least point me to like sources that would have, answered them in a more thoughtful and robust way, then there's a chance that things could have developed differently for me. So I think that it's very important that when people do have questions, that those questions are taken seriously. And if people don't have the good answers, and, oftentimes we don't, some of these questions are very difficult, you should at least know where you can point people so that they can go and find help with these doubts and these problems that they have.
Well, and that last part is something that I always used to tell students back when I was a youth pastor and working with youth all the time. And, I mean, as a teacher now, I still try to tell students is like, there's nothing wrong when you're talking with an atheist friend, or when you're talking with somebody, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, that is a great question. Let me look into that and I'll get back to you. And in fact, I actually
Mhm.
think it fosters good discussion with people when you do actually follow through with that, right? When you say, okay, well, I have no idea how to answer that, but to your point, maybe I know where to look, right? And so
Mhm.
they go and they look and they research, and then they come back, hey, remember that thing we were talking about a little while back? Well, I went and looked into it. Here's an answer for you. I think that actually demonstrates a lot of love for that person. It demonstrates that you actually take them seriously, and it fosters good discussion. And so, well,
Sure.
with that
And it
sort of
helps you build a
framework,
relationship. Yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And so, with that sort of framework kind of set forth here, well, why is it so important, right? I mean, there's a lot of people that are leaving Christianity, that have been leaving Christianity. I mean, we have this downward trend for a lot of years now, and we want to be able to help halt that as much as we can, when it comes to at least actually being prepared to give people answers for this. And so, hopefully, this video can serve as a bit of a primer for that. And so, well, maybe if someone who is brand new, who is listening to this video, has no idea, they've heard this word apologetics, right? They've heard us throw this around a little bit, and they're not exactly sure what that means. And so, how would you define Christian apologetics? What even is that?
So what I would say is apologetics is a part of theology. It's engaged with philosophy, natural and social science, history, art and literature. And the purpose of this discipline, the purpose of apologetics, is to show that Christianity is true, good, and beautiful, and that it's superior in these respects to alternative philosophies and religions. Apologetics, I'd say it's aimed at both believers and non-believers. So oftentimes people think that apologetics is just for non-believers, but it's for both. It's for everybody that's concerned with the truth of Christianity. So for non-believers, the use of apologetics is primarily to remove impediments to belief so that the intelligibility and the attractiveness of Christianity are evident. For believers, there are at least three uses that I can think of apologetics. So one would be to assuage doubts about the truth of Christian doctrine, something we've already been talking about. Another would be to remind believers of the value of Christian practices for human well-being. And another would be to aid in outreach to non-believers, to help Christians be more confident in their witnessing. Apologetics at its best, it's going to appeal to the intellect, it's going to appeal to the heart, and it's going to appeal to the imagination. So it's going to appeal to the whole person. And we see examples of this broad appeal to all aspects of the human person, I think, in the writings of people like Chesterton and Lewis. So I do hold them up as good examples of what apologetics can be at its best and what we should be aiming for in our apologetic work. Now, I certainly don't have the range of interests of a Chesterton or a Lewis, but I do think that they have done apologetics at the highest level. And so if we want to promote apologetics, if we want to see apologetics flourish, we do need to take our cues from them. So apologetics is going to make it clear that Christianity and true human flourishing and fulfillment are intimately connected. I think that's one of the goals that every apologist should have, is to show that Christianity and flourishing are connected. What I think we're really after as apologists is we want to give somebody an identity or a self-understanding in which Christianity is so integral, so meaningful, so important, so valuable that unbelief or apostasy just becomes unthinkable. You know, Christianity, when somebody thinks of themselves, the first thing they think about is just who they are as a Christian and how important and meaningful that is to them. I want all Christians to think in those terms. Some of the topics that apologists are going to focus on are the existence of God, the reliability of the Bible, and the identity of Jesus. Those are all foundational issues, but apologetics also deals with a lot of other things. So it's going to talk about the relationship of faith and reason, or philosophy and theology. It's going to talk about the problem of evil, the truth of other religions. And there are also interconfessional apologetics. You could call this other things. You could call it like polemical theology, where the apologist is not so much trying to show the truth of basic Christian doctrines, but is trying to show that a particular confession or expression of Christianity is the correct one. And I'm interested in both of those kinds of apologetics. I'd say my own interest is primarily in the former, in the general kind of apologetics, but the latter is certainly also important.
And so we've talked about this already a little bit, but why should the average person, perhaps someone who's watching this video who doesn't personally enjoy debate, right? Or they don't enjoy argument, they don't enjoy necessarily even high-level philosophy or anything like this. Why should that average person care about apologetics?
Yeah, it's a very important question. You know, I myself am not particularly interested in debating people, but I do enjoy discussions, and I certainly enjoy talking about and thinking about ideas. So I don't think you have to be somebody that always wants to be combating atheists to be an apologist or have an interest in apologetics. Many people have the impression that apologetics is by and for specialists, right? So it's for scholars, it's professors, it's pastors. Those are the people that apologetics is for. And it is true that most teaching and writing in apologetics is done by these kinds of people who have some kind of expertise in this area. But the things that apologetics deals with, these are things that all Christians have a stake in. All Christians have doubts, at least on occasion. All Christians in the modern world, we all know unbelievers. So non-Christian beliefs, non-Christian identities, these things often appear as real options for people. And that being so, I think it's important that we understand why we are Christian and why other people should be Christian. So it's a cliche. It's one that we've already even mentioned this morning, but people in our churches, they need to understand not only what we believe, but why we believe it. The why is really important, especially in a world in which you're surrounded by unbelief. There's also a very troubling rate of attrition in our churches that you've also touched on. So a lot of our young people, they leave and they don't come back, which is obviously tragic. And I'm convinced that a lack of apologetic knowledge often has something to do with that, either, on the part of the people leaving or the part of the people that would like them to stay. Many times young people, they don't adequately grasp the truth, the goodness, and the beauty of the Christian faith. And when they leave home, they find themselves drawn to other perspectives, other lifestyles, and the church no longer has any attraction for them. When we talk about people who deconstruct or people who apostatize, I think those are usually people who never really saw how Christianity can meet all of their needs. So Christianity addresses the whole person, right? And it's going to meet all of your spiritual needs: intellectual, moral, relational, aesthetic. Christianity takes care of all of those things. It has an abundance of things that you can draw upon to find fulfillment. But I think for people who deconstruct, oftentimes they just see Christianity as like a set of rules, or a set of arbitrary rules, or perhaps as a social club, right? Just a place where you go to hang out with other people and interact with people. And these people who leave the church, they reach a point where these things, the rules or the social aspect, they lose whatever appeal they might once have had. So I think apologists, they need to articulate how orthodox biblical Christianity can meet those needs that I was just talking about: the intellectual needs, the moral needs, the relational needs, the aesthetic needs. Because I think when people really understand how Christianity addresses those things or takes care of those things, then they will understand why Christianity is important, and the risk of them leaving the church will be much reduced.
And so as people maybe that are watching this video that might be completely new to defending their faith, and they might be saying, so apologetics, so it's speaking in defense, it addresses the whole person. Maybe this is something that I do want to learn. It's important, I think, that they know that there are actually different methods of apologetics. And so what are some of those different methods, and which one do you personally use and recommend?
So you're certainly right. There's a number of different ways of doing apologetics. And there are various ways of classifying or categorizing these methods. And if you read apologetics books, generally speaking, there will be a discussion of this. Some people are going to claim that there's a few basic types, and then others are going to subdivide those basic types into more types. I've seen people claim that there are 10 or 12 different ways of doing apologetics. However, I tend to think that these differences can be and often are overemphasized. So I think it's most helpful to ask about the basic epistemological standpoint that an apologist is working with. And epistemology means the study of knowledge, right? Like how we know things and what the truth is. So I think your epistemological standpoint is going to have an effect on how you address apologetics in general, or how you handle all apologetic issues and questions. So epistemology is extremely important. And I think if we look at the different options when it comes to epistemology about how people think about knowledge, what we see is that there are two fundamentally different approaches in Christian apologetics today. So most apologists are realists. And what that means is that they believe there's an objective world that's outside of our mind, and knowledge is acquired when we come to know this world as it is in itself, or as it really is. Okay, that's why it's called realism, right? So realists are generally going to say that even though error is commonplace, even though people are wrong about all kinds of things, God has given all people the capacities that they need to know reality, at least to some extent. Okay, so knowing the truth about reality is a real possibility for human beings just by virtue of being human. Okay, so for this perspective, showing that Christianity is true means showing that Christian beliefs correspond to the facts about reality. And the facts get to dictate what is true and what counts as a reasonable interpretation. It seems to me that the apologists who share this basic picture, they're generally going to have viewpoints and methods that are largely compatible. Okay, so if you get a bunch of apologists in a room, they're all realists, even if they have slightly different approaches, most of what they say is going to be helpful or of use to the other apologists. Okay, they're going to be able to share insights. They're going to be able to share arguments with each other, and they'll generally appreciate what the others have to say. So that's why I think, overly compartmentalizing things is not necessarily helpful. I think it's best to just focus on these basic epistemological issues. So some of these realist apologists, they'll be called classical apologists. Some of them will be called evidential apologists. Some of them might be called cumulative case apologists. But I think generally speaking, like I said, any insight they have is going to be of some value to the other apologists who operate with this basic realist approach. Their differences usually have more to do with just matters of emphasis, like what they're choosing to focus on or choosing to highlight, than any strong or fundamental disagreement. So that's the realist camp in apologetics, and that's the camp that I would say I belong to. There are also apologists who work with an idealist or an anti-realist epistemology. And these people are going to claim that truth is not a matter of correspondence with objective reality. It's not a matter of our beliefs matching these objective facts that are out there, but of coherence or logical consistency between beliefs. So when our beliefs are coherent, when they all fit together, then they are true. And they're going to say that facts don't delimit, or they don't dictate what counts as a proper interpretation. What they would say is that there's an authoritative interpretation, and that decides what counts as a fact. In other words, it's how God sees things, right? How God chooses to interpret reality decides what counts as a fact. And so to know what the facts are, we need to know God's interpretation. So this is the approach that I see at work in presuppositional apologetics. And presuppositional apologetics is a modern method that's highly indebted to German and British idealism. And German and British idealism, those are schools of philosophy that were popular in the late 18th and 19th centuries. So presuppositionalism draws on the framework that the idealists use, and it kind of adapts it for apologetic purposes. Presuppositionalism is not really interested in seeing which beliefs are confirmed by objective evidence, because the proponents of this perspective, they're going to say there's no direct access to objective evidence. Human beings don't have the ability to come to terms with reality as it is in itself simply by virtue of being human. What they're going to say is that reality is always seen through the lens of a worldview. Okay, so this term worldview is really important for the presuppositional apologist. The idea is that you can't see anything apart from a worldview. The worldview is like a pair of glasses that's on your face and you can't take them off. Okay, so you're always seeing things from a certain point of view. And for the presuppositionalist, worldviews, they provide the categories for interpreting and understanding reality. So instead of reality kind of presenting itself to you and you just having to grasp it and take it in, you have a much more kind of active role in interpreting reality. And it's based on the worldview that you bring to things, the worldview that you bring to the world and your understanding of it. So this way of thinking, it's focused on seeing which worldview or system of belief seems to be free from contradictions. Okay, I mentioned that coherence is really important to the presuppositionalist. So when they're assessing the truth of worldviews, what they're going to say is not which worldview matches the facts, but they're going to say which worldview is most free from contradictions. And their assumption is going to be that logical consistency is really the only sure sign of truth. Okay, because like I said, they don't think we have direct access to reality. So we're not able to just determine what is true on the basis of what the objective facts are, because facts are not self-interpreting. They need to be interpreted, right? They don't have like some inherent intelligibility that presents itself to us. So we need to bring the intelligibility to the facts. We need to make them by placing them in our worldview. Now, my own preference is for, like I said, the former realist kind of apologetics. And there are there's both theoretical and practical reasons for why I prefer the realist approach. So theoretically, I don't think coherence is sufficient to guarantee the truth of any set of beliefs. So incoherence is often indicative of falsehood, right? If your beliefs are incoherent, they're probably untrue. But beliefs can be coherent and they can still fail to reflect reality. Moreover, Christianity is a religion that's predicated on various mysteries, right? Like the Trinity, the Incarnation. And these things are not always transparent to human logic or human reason. And this means it can be dangerous, I think, to assume that a belief is false just because it stands in tension with other beliefs. So we don't want to be too committed to this idea that logical consistency is the be all and end all for determining the truth, because there are mysteries in Christianity that are not, like I said, totally transparent to human reason. And I also think it's untrue that facts are meaningless apart from interpretation. So that's something that presuppositionalists generally claim. But like I said, your worldview determines what the facts are, not the other way around. It's not the facts are not primary. And I would say that everything has intrinsic intelligibility because it has an inherent form or an essence that defines what it is. This is a very classical way of thinking about things that's indebted to Aristotle. Okay, everything has its own form or essence, and that's what makes it what it is. It doesn't. We don't need to give it an identity through how we interpret it. It has an identity in itself, and our job is to grasp that. Our job is to come to terms with that. So we don't need an authoritative interpretation to establish what things are. We just have to come to know things as they are in themselves. And in my view, saying that facts are the result of interpretation or that facts depend on your worldview, that just opens the door to skepticism and relativism. Okay, because obviously there's a lot of different worldviews, and if they all see the facts differently, and there's really no way to arbitrate or judge between them except on the basis of logical consistency, then we're going to have problems. Partly because adjudicating these things is not easy. Right? Every worldview is going to claim that the other worldviews are inconsistent, or they're going to claim that there are problems with the other worldviews. So I think this kind of lands us in a quagmire, frankly, when we're trying to think about the truth or figure out the truth in this way. So in sum, what I think you see with presuppositionalism is a form of rationalism, right? It kind of puts too much emphasis on logical consistency and the use of reason. And I think that when you do that, you easily slide into skepticism. You slide into this view that it all depends on your worldview. It all depends on the presuppositions that you bring to things. And so people are left with relativism. So even though that's not the aim, of course, of the presuppositionalist, I think that oftentimes the tools and the concepts and the methods that they use, it lends itself to that. So it leads Christians to adopt kind of a relativist way of thinking or a subjectivist way of thinking that I don't think is helpful. And practically, I think that one of the problems with presuppositional, a really important problem, is that I think the way that presuppositionalists think about things, the way that they conceptualize things, it's going to strike a lot of people as strange. It's going to strike a lot of people as counterintuitive. If you just talk to a person on the street who has not studied philosophy, has not studied theology, and you use a presuppositional method, oftentimes that person is going to think that you're saying things that are very strange. Like, for example, one of the classical contentions of presuppositionalism is that there's an antithesis or a very strong divide between believers and unbelievers. And they're going to say that the unbeliever, insofar as he's an unbeliever, and so insofar as he's a consistent unbeliever, doesn't actually know anything. Now, if you're going to make that claim to a person on the street who hasn't studied these topics in depth, they're going to think that sounds very strange, right? That unbelievers don't know anything. They're going to think that sounds absurd. And presuppositionalists have ways of explaining what they mean and trying to make that sound reasonable. But my point is just that presuppositionalism is going to often strike people as being a strange way of conceiving of things. It's going to strike people as being very counterintuitive. And what that means is that in apologetic encounters, I think it oftentimes kind of gets in the way of what the apologist is trying to do. It gives us a speculative method that itself is open to significant criticism. And I think it's noteworthy that many presuppositionalists, they seem to spend more time defending presuppositionalism than defending the basic truths of Christianity. Right? If you pay attention to apologetic debates, you see a lot of focus on just the method and about the truth of the method or the biblical grounds of the method, and defending the existence of God or the resurrection or the deity of Christ. These are things that seem to be almost like secondary in importance to a lot of the presuppositionalists. Now, I think a lot of them would say that defending presuppositionalism and defending Christianity amounts to the same thing. They're going to say these things are inseparable. So if you're defending one, you're defending the other. But I don't think that's how it strikes most observers, especially ones that are not well versed in these kinds of discussions. I think most people are instinctive realists, right? The average person approaches the world with a realist mindset or with realist assumptions. And so because of that, since we're trying to reach these people and we're not trying to get them embroiled in unnecessary philosophical debates, it makes sense for apologists to be realists as well. Now, I think that, like I said, theoretically, realism has more to recommend it. But I also think just looking at it from a purely pragmatic standpoint, or just in terms of the influence it has on our interactions with unbelievers or the fruits that it bears when we're having discussions with people who have doubts, I think it's clear there that realism is more effective and works better too.
And I think for the person that's brand new to this as well, where you see a lot of the difference, the practical difference on the ground is you might see a presuppositionalist when they're debating somebody, they'll focus exclusively, or at least almost exclusively, on internal critiques of the other worldview. Right. So you will see, and to be fair to good presuppositionalist apologists, I do actually think a lot of the critiques they provide of atheist worldviews or of other alternatives to the Christian worldview, I do actually think that a lot of the critiques they provide are actually devastating against the other side. But a lot of the time, the presup apologist, as I guess presup for short for presuppositionalism for the rest of this, but the presup apologist will spend all of their time really just doing these devastating internal critiques, at least if they're doing their job properly, of these other worldviews. But you might not really see them provide a positive account a lot of the time for why Christianity itself is true. The idea simply seems to be that, well, I'm going to posit the Christian worldview. Maybe they'll explain how it accounts for a few things. And then they'll say, well, but we're going to argue for the impossibility of the contrary. And so if none of these other worldviews can be true, then Christianity is the only one left standing, and it's kind of like Christianity wins by default, right? Mm-hmm. And so normally people say, well, wait, how can you sit here and debunk every other worldview? That seems impossible. The charitable take here on the presupper is he says, actually, no, all these different worldviews have actually only a few divergent sort of points or differences in approach from which they all stem from. And so if I can just attack the places where they all stem from, then I can just cut them off at the root, and all of these die. Christianity's left standing. And so this is the sort of approach on the ground that people might see from a presup apologist, whereas the classical apologist, a lot of the time, will actually just give positive argumentation. They might stand up and give, as maybe we'll talk about here in a second, different arguments for God's existence, whether something like a sort of cosmological argument or a design argument, fine-tuning argument, just a subset of design argument, and so on and so forth, right? And so a classical apologist might stand there and say, well, let me give you the positive reasons from, just looking around at the world, how we can come to the existence of God. Then once they succeed there, or if they succeed there, Then they move on to, well, let me explain to you why the Bible is trustworthy, why you should believe in the resurrection. And then from there, they make the move from there to, well, then that must mean Christianity is true. You should be a Christian. And so these are the two sort of different approaches. And then in your book, you mentioned, obviously, some evidentialists kind of skip sometimes even just the arguing for God part. And it's just like, well, I'm going to argue for the reliability of the Bible and the resurrection. And so we can almost take that as a shortcut, because if the resurrection is real, then obviously God exists and Christ has been vindicated in his claims. Christianity is true. Right. And so these are some of the different approaches. And you did a great job of explaining sort of the undergirding philosophical factors that lie behind these approaches, which I think a lot of the time people miss out on. Now, maybe before we move on here from this question, maybe we can talk a little bit about sometimes people, because they get so passionate at defending, I think, their particular view of a given issue, maybe a classical apologist defending his, or the presupper certainly defending his view, as they spend a lot of their time doing. People sometimes overlook, I think, the positive things that each one of these views has to offer. And so maybe since you've spent a significant amount of time explaining why you're not a presuppositionalist, what are some of the positive things that you do think presuppositionalists kind of bring to the table, or some of the things that they actually do that are beneficial as an apologetics approach?
Well, I would just agree with what you said. I think in terms of critiquing other perspectives, they are good at pointing to real problems that atheists and non-believers really do have to wrestle with, particularly when it comes to morality. Right? If an atheist is not a committed nihilist, it's going to be very hard for them to justify why they believe there are true moral truths, or why there are axiological truths, because atheism is just not fertile ground for that kind of thing. Right? It's a pretty barren worldview, and if you're going to try to get objective values with on those grounds, or on those presuppositions, you are going to have a really difficult time. It's a very arid and like I said, barren perspective on reality. And when that's the case, you're not going to have an abundant growth of objective values. You're not going to be able to have moral facts. You're not going to be able to have aesthetic facts and so forth. So that's something that's very valuable. But that's something that any apologist can make use of. You don't have to be a presuppositionalist. You don't have to adhere to these philosophical assumptions that presuppositionalists generally do. So just pointing to contradictions, or pointing to inconsistencies in what a non-believer is saying, that's something that all apologists should feel free to do. And it's something that long before presuppositionalism came on the scene, that's something that apologists were doing, right? They were looking at what the deists were saying, or they were looking at what adherents of other religions were saying, and they were pointing out problems. They were pointing out ways in which these perspectives were inconsistent. So, you don't need to be a presuppositionalist to do this. We can learn how to do it well from presuppositionalists. So I will grant that the approach does have some value in that regard. But I think that in terms of our undergirding philosophical perspective, I definitely think that realism has more to recommend it.
And for me personally, lately, like I was telling you before we started recording here, I've been doing a lot of reading into Thomist authors when it comes to epistemology. And whereas before I was kind of leaning a little bit toward the presuppositionalist camp, reading a lot of these Thomist authors was just like this breath of fresh air that I didn't realize I was going to get when I started reading them. And so these days, anyway, I certainly would agree with you that I think the realist sort of perspective is the one that makes the most sense. And I think also is just the most intuitive, like you were explaining earlier, right? You spend a lot less time explaining to the person what you mean, although the presupper can do it, right? I mean, they can say like, well, what I mean when I say that you don't know anything, atheist that I'm talking to, is actually that your worldview doesn't give you the necessary preconditions for knowledge. And so even though on the ground you personally obviously know things, well, you only know those because you're borrowing from the Christian worldview. But then notice even that explanation, which is fairly introductory, this is what the informed presupper will give, you have a lot of baggage that you have to explain there. Whereas if you kind of show up with the classical approach, this is what I've done for a long time when I'm talking to atheist friends, and praise the Lord, seeing success there a lot of the time, is explaining, well, hey, here's why your worldview doesn't account for things like morality, right? I think for the average person, as maybe we'll talk about later, for the average person, you explain that their worldview doesn't account for morality. And that's a really big deal because they obviously, the average person anyway, when they're not in denial, understands that there are actually moral laws out there and that evil's a real thing, right? And so that's kind of devastating. And then if you follow that up with arguments for the existence of God, for the reliability of the Bible, someone who's actually curious and open to the truth, a lot of the time anyway, in my personal experience, I've seen uh, respond really well to that sort of approach. And so, well, with that, right, having gotten a picture of the different ways that people go about doing apologetics, what apologetics is, why it matters, let's maybe jump into a little bit of apologetics. What is personally your favorite argument for the existence of God? And before you share that, just so that people know at home, again, there are, I don't know, maybe hundreds of arguments, maybe more than that, for the existence of God, with a lot of different variations, a lot of different ways of, sometimes it's a lot of different takes on the same style of argument, right? And so you have what you call cosmological arguments, you have ontological arguments, there are arguments from design, teleological arguments, and all of these have a bunch of subsets of arguments. And again, Christianity has been around for thousands of years, and so people have been arguing for God's existence for a really, really long time. Something you point out at the beginning of your book, something that maybe the average person is not aware of, right? They read a single Richard Dawkins book, or they listen to a talk from Dawkins, and they're like, "Oh, it's all over. Christianity has been destroyed." It's like they don't seem to understand that the best and brightest minds throughout most of human history have been Christians, and they've actually a lot of the time provided their own version of arguments for God. And so there's just deep depths that someone could plunge into here. But being that this is an introductory video, maybe just share one of those arguments, your favorite for God's existence.
Okay. Yeah. Everything you said, I totally agree with. There's a wealth of arguments out there, lots of interesting things to work through and consider. Some of the arguments I think are brilliant and cogent and extremely convincing, and then some of them not so much. But part of the job of the apologist is just to kind of work through them and figure out what works well and what's going to be convincing to the average person. But even even the bad arguments are the ones that are not necessarily that convincing. Oftentimes they're very interesting to think through. So I really enjoy natural theology. I enjoy reading it. I enjoy thinking about it. It's spiritually edifying. It's intellectually edifying. It's just I think a great thing to do, and it's also going to help you in your witnessing. When you run into somebody who has doubts about God's reality, being able to give them a good argument, I think, can be helpful. It can steer the conversation in a different direction, or it can even steer that person's interests in different directions. It can steer their life in a different direction. So these kinds of arguments I do think have value. There have been voices in the history of Christianity who have tried to dismiss them, or have tried to say that they don't actually have any impact, or they're not effective. But I think that there's plenty of cases in which people have run into these arguments, they have thought through these arguments, and it has made a difference to how they think about things. So the argument that you can ignore natural theology because it doesn't make any difference to anything, it doesn't change anybody's mind, it's useless in terms of converting people, I think that's all false. And I think that there are plenty of examples out there of people who have changed their mind because they've run into these arguments. So to answer your question, the one that I want to talk about is the argument from contingency. And this is a form of the cosmological argument. So as you mentioned, all of the basic types of arguments have lots of subtypes. There's lots of different formulations and variations on these basic types of argument. And the argument from contingency is a cosmological argument, and even it comes in different forms. There's like a Thomistic form of it. There's a Leibnizian form. And those names have to deal with the philosophers that first put them forward. And the form that I prefer is the Leibnizian form. So that's what I will try to give you an overview of, is the Leibnizian form. So to understand this argument, understand what it's trying to get at or what it's trying to prove, we first have to just talk about some basic terms. Like I said, it's called an argument from contingency. Contingent things that might exist, but also might not exist. So a contingent thing, it's possible, could exist, but it's not necessary, doesn't have to exist. For a thing to be possible, what we would want to say is that there's nothing about it that's inherently self-contradictory. Okay, so a unicorn, for example, is possible, right? It doesn't exist, but it could exist. There's something about the idea of a unicorn that makes it so that it's impossible. But a square circle, something that's both a square and a circle at the exact same time in the same respect, that is not possible, right? Because that's inherently self-contradictory. So possible things, they can exist even if they don't. And we would want to contrast a contingent thing with a necessary thing. A thing is necessary if it has to exist, if it must exist, if it couldn't fail to exist. So since contingent things can cease to exist, or they might not ever exist, they are not necessary. Contingent things don't count as necessary. So one sign that something is contingent, and obviously if we're going to say that there are contingent things and necessary things, we have to know how to distinguish them. A sign that something is contingent is that it is changing or changeable. Because if something can change, that means it doesn't have to be the way that it is. And what this means is that it's not necessary. So anything that's in motion, anything that can be divided, anything that's in time, that's going to be subject to change. And all of these things by their very nature cannot be necessary. So if anything's in time, if anything's divisible, it's going to be contingent. So all of the physical things that we see all around us, these are all contingent things. The next thing I need to mention, the next concept that we need to talk about, is something called the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason. This is often abbreviated as the PSR, And this is a philosophical term for a truth that most of us naturally believe. It's something that most of us accept without even thinking about it as we go about our lives. And essentially, what this principle asserts is that everything that exists or occurs has a sufficient or an adequate explanation for why it exists or occurs. So in other words, things have reasons for why they are. Okay, they don't just pop into existence. And the important thing to grasp is that virtually all of us take this for granted. We take for granted that everything that exists must have some kind of adequate reason for why it exists. Right? That's what makes the world intelligible. That's what makes things make sense, is that they have reasons. So we might not know what the reason is in a given case, and we might not even know how to find out what the reason is, but we assume that there's a reason. We assume that with everything that we experience, that there's some kind of reason for it. And I don't think anybody has to teach us this. I think this is just a way that people think. I think humans are wired to think this way, and this is something that is self-evident to us. Now, what I would say is that people believe the PSR, and they believe it intuitively because God has designed them to believe it. In the Lutheran tradition, there's been a belief in something called natural notions or common notions. And these are things that God has created us to believe, things that God has created us to naturally regard as true. So if we were to investigate what humans believe across different cultures, I think we would see that there would be nearly universal assent to this principle, right? Except for people that maybe are insane or mentally ill. They might deny it, but all healthy, normal, functional people are going to agree that this is something that they utilize in their daily life. This is something that they take for granted in their daily life. But I think the universality of the belief, the fact that all people seem to believe it, that's not the only thing that makes it reasonable to regard as true. So if we look at our experience of the world, there's no obvious exceptions to this rule that things have reasons. So the world, it always operates according to laws. It has patterns. There's order everywhere. Similar events produce similar outcomes. And things are not just randomly appearing or happening. If the principle of sufficient reason were not true, then that would be the case, right? Things could exist or occur without a sufficient explanation. And then we would expect that the world would look a lot more chaotic and unpredictable than it is. But of course, there's explanations everywhere for things. That's what science is all about, is finding explanations. And whenever there are mysteries about physical objects or physical phenomena, these generally can be solved just by patient and diligent inquiry. We can figure out why things are happening the way that they are. So the principle of sufficient reason has a lot to recommend it, a lot going for it. I think it's totally in line with common sense, and I think that there are really significant consequences of rejecting it. So I think we should definitely regard this principle as true, that everything has a sufficient reason or sufficient explanation for why it exists. So we've talked about how things are contingent, and we've talked about the principle of sufficient reason. So the next thing I want to note is that if a contingent thing exists, then it's going to require an explanation. It's going to have a sufficient reason for why it exists. And this explanation is going to have to be outside of itself. And this is because the contingent thing, like I said, it can either exist or not exist. And since everything has an explanation, that means that there has to be an explanation for why it exists instead of not existing. There has to be some reason for why this particular animal or this particular tree exists instead of not existing. And I said its explanation has to be outside of itself, because if it had its explanation inside of itself, if its explanation was internal to it in some sense, or if it would be, kind of its own explanation, then it would be self-causing. And the idea of a self-causing thing doesn't make any sense. Okay, that would be absurd, because nothing can bring itself into existence from non-existence. And it should be obvious why that's the case, but the reason is that it would have to exist before it existed, which obviously doesn't make any sense. So things can't be self-causing. So a contingent thing, it's always a dependent thing. It always needs an explanation for why it exists. And excuse me, what it depends on is going to have to be something else. It's going to have to be something external to itself. Now, the next thing we have to ask is about this thing that it depends on, right? Is the thing that it depends on, is it going to be contingent or necessary? That's the next question. Those are the only options for existing things. Okay, things are either necessary, they're contingent, or they're impossible. And obviously, whatever a contingent thing depends on is going to have to be either contingent or necessary. It can't be, dependent on something that's impossible, because impossible things like a square circle don't exist. So it's going to have to depend on one of those two things, a contingent thing or a necessary thing. And what this argument from contingency concludes, the upshot of all this, is that any contingent thing has to ultimately depend on a necessary reality, something that has to exist, something that cannot fail to exist, something that has to be what it is. So whether it's a pebble, whether it's a planet, whether it's a galaxy, if it's contingent, it's going to need a necessary being to explain it. Now, the next thing to do is to see why that's the case. Why is it the case that any contingent thing has to be ultimately dependent on a necessary being? In other words, why is it impossible that other contingent things could be an ultimate explanation for something contingent? So let's first of all, let's just imagine that a contingent thing is explained by another contingent thing. So we have something contingent, and then prior to it, in some sense, there's another contingent thing. So the next thing we're going to have to ask ourselves is, what explains this other contingent thing? And if that thing is also dependent on a contingent thing, this is just going to continue, right? We're going to have to keep on asking what the explanation is. And anything that is contingent is always going to require a further explanation. Like I said, because it's going to have to depend on something outside of itself or external to itself, it can't be self-causing. So anything contingent is going to be dependent on something else. And the question we have to ask is, can this chain of dependence or this chain of explanation, can it go on forever? Okay, can you just have one contingent thing followed by another contingent thing going back forever? Is an infinite regress, in other words, a possibility? An infinite regress is going to be a feature of any cosmological argument. Okay, it's going to be a relevant factor. Can you have an infinite regress that just goes back forever? Because obviously, if you want to reject the idea that the world is dependent on God, you're going to probably want to think that some kind of infinite regress is a possibility. Now, there are actually two ways that we can think about how a contingent thing is explained by something else. And depending on which way we're thinking about, our answer to this question about an infinite regress is going to be somewhat different. But in both cases, we're going to come to a similar conclusion. And that conclusion is that we're going to have to posit a necessary being. So there's two ways in which like I said, there's two ways we can think about how contingent things are explained by other things. But regardless of which way we're thinking about, we're still going to have to posit a necessary being in the end. We're still going to have to say that regardless of how we think about this contingent thing and how it's explained, we still need a necessary being to ultimately explain it. So let me go over these two ways. The first way is to think about it in terms of think about the dependence of the explanation in terms of an originating cause. And this is the way that we most frequently think about how explanations in the physical world or in the temporal world work. So Jim's existence, for example, Jim's existence is partly explained by his father, Jeff, right? He exists because Jeff existed. And then Jeff's existence is partly explained by his father, John. And then John's existence is partly explained by his father, Julius, and so on and so forth, right? And the question is, could this go on forever? Could it go back forever? Now, we obviously know that human beings have not existed forever, right? That's something that is evident to people today. But merely for the sake of argument, we could grant that this is an open question, right? So Aristotle, he apparently thought that all species had existed forever, right? He didn't have any concept of creation. He didn't have a concept of evolution and so forth. So he just thought that, the things that he experienced had existed perpetually, existed forever. We could also entertain the view of the history of the universe that's put forward by some modern secularists, right? What they would say is that everything in our universe originated maybe with a Big Bang, and then prior to the Big Bang, perhaps there were other universes, perhaps there were cosmic cycles that just kind of go back forever, without any kind of beginning. So just for the sake of argument, this is not something I believe, but just for the sake of argument, we can accept that an infinite regress of originating causes is possible. We can say, okay, let's just assume that could happen, that chain of causes going back in time could go on forever. So the next question we have to ask is, if we have an infinite regress of contingent originating causes, like the father example, have we provided a sufficient explanation of the effects that we have in mind? And it might seem to some people like the answer is yes. Okay, so if you can just point to something prior in time that seems to provide an adequate explanation, then it may seem like that thing is adequately explained, and then you could just keep doing the same thing for each subsequent thing in the series, right? As long as any given thing is explained by what came before it, then it might appear like there's nothing left to explain. But there's a very significant problem that is still here, that remains. And that is that if everything in this series is contingent, right? So if we're going backwards in time and we're going back forever, and we just have an endless series of contingent things, then the series itself is contingent. Okay, the series itself has an ontological status, and that ontological status is one of being contingent. And so what this means is that the series itself is going to stand in need of an explanation. The series can't account for itself, and it needs to be accounted for. It's something that has reality, and so it needs a sufficient explanation, and it cannot provide that for itself. Nothing in the series is going to be able to explain it, because then the series would be its own cause, and we've already seen that that's absurd. So what this means is that if we want to explain this infinite series of contingent things, we're going to have to appeal to something that is outside of the series, something that transcends the series, something that is itself not contingent, something that's absolutely necessary. So a necessary being provides what we need because it doesn't depend on anything to be what it is. Okay, because it's necessary, it doesn't have to be explained by something outside of itself. or beyond itself. It can be its own explanation. Its necessity provides that. It provides the sufficient reason for itself. So if we're going to have this endless series of contingent things, we need to posit something that the series can be grounded in, something that can be a foundation for this series. And the only thing that can be is a necessary being that has its own reason for existing in itself. So that's the first way to think about how contingent things can be explained. Okay, we could think of it in terms of a temporal series going back in time forever. And like I said, even if there were an infinite series, which I don't think, on the basis of Scripture, I reject, but even if there were an infinite series, we would still need a necessary being if we were going to have a complete and full explanation of that series. Now, there's also the other way of explaining a contingent thing. So I've said that a contingent thing can either exist or not exist. And if it does exist, then it's going to require a reason for why it exists. And it's important to realize that this is true of any contingent thing at any given time. So right now at this moment, there's no necessity that I'm sitting here speaking with you, right? The fact that I'm speaking with you is entirely contingent. My existence at this moment is entirely contingent. There's no necessity to it. But what this means is that there has to be a reason right now for why I'm existing rather than failing to exist. There has to be something that's keeping me in existence right now. And we can call this a sustaining cause, or we could call this a conserving cause. So in the previous discussion, we were talking about an originating cause, where something originated from. But we also have to explain what's keeping something in existence, not just where it came from, but why it's staying in existence at this moment. Because contingent things do need a sustaining cause. They don't have a reason for existing in themselves. So they need something that is conserving their being. Something has to be making it the case that they exist at the present moment. Now, in my case, this obviously can't be my parents, right? My parents are not keeping me in existence right now. My being here, it's not due to anything that they're presently doing. And in fact, nothing in my past could be keeping me in existence right now, because past events don't sustain things in the present, right? My great-grandfather is not doing anything that is having an effect on the present, not in the sense of keeping something in existence. So what could be keeping me in existence, right? What could be conserving or sustaining my being? Well, once again, it would have to be something that's either contingent or necessary. And it would have to be something that's presently operative, something that is making a difference to things right now through how it's acting on them or how it's influencing them. So let's assume that right now I'm being sustained or conserved by something contingent. Something contingent is keeping me in existence right now. Then what we're going to have to say is that this contingent thing is also going to need a sustaining cause to keep it in existence. And so once again, we're faced with this question: could this go on forever? Is it the case that I could be sustained in my being right now by something contingent, and that thing could be sustained by something contingent, and so on and so forth? Could that go on forever? Well, I think the answer is no. So if this series of sustaining causes went on forever without any termination, then there would be no explanation for how anything exists right now. Everything would be receiving its actuality or receiving its power of existing from something else, but there would be no source of this actuality, right? It wouldn't be actually coming from anything, which is the problem. So it would be comparable to like an electric lamp that's plugged into a socket in the wall, right? When you have something plugged into the wall, it's receiving electricity. It's getting power from the socket. And the socket in turn is getting power from a circuit, and then the circuit from the electrical panel, and the electrical panel from transformers, and so on and so forth. Okay, a line of causes. There's a series of causes here, and everything is kind of sustaining or conserving everything else. It's keeping that power flowing. Now, if the sequence went on forever, though, something very strange would be happening, in that the lamp would be generating light, but there wouldn't be anything that actually generates electricity. Okay, there wouldn't be anything that's causing electricity to flow to my lamp at this present moment. And what we all know is that at some point there has to be a power plant behind all this series of causes that's actually generating the electricity. The electricity has to be coming from somewhere. Now, the exact same thing is true of my being. All right? The same thing is true of the causes that are sustaining me in existence right now. So if they were all contingent, and thus they all were requiring a sustaining cause themselves, something that's keeping them in being, then they would be equivalent to a power source that doesn't actually generate electricity itself. So to have something equivalent to the power plant that is providing being for other things, that is able to keep them in existence, we're going to need a necessary being. Okay, so on this analogy, the power plant is equal to a necessary being. All right, the necessary being doesn't depend on anything else to keep it in being, and because of that, it's able to keep other things in being. So if we're thinking in terms of a sustaining cause, I think we have to conclude that an infinite regress of contingent causes is impossible. That would be like the example of electricity coming out of the socket when there's no power plant. So there has to be a necessary being that I am presently dependent on, that I am presently being sustained in my being by. So what I think we've seen by considering these two types of explanation in terms of origination and in terms of conservation is that they both indicate that a necessary being is required to provide an ultimate explanation for anything that's contingent, anything that can exist or not exist. And it's important to note that this conclusion is not dependent on any kind of empirical science. So there are some theistic arguments that are dependent on current science, but this one is not. So it's not going to be debunked, or it's not going to be refuted by any kind of scientific discovery. It can't be undermined by science because it's not dependent on science. So even if we grant that it's conceivable that a sequence of causes could go back in time forever, even if somebody claimed that there was some kind of scientific proof of that, we would still have to posit a necessary being to fully explain anything contingent, either in terms of its origination or in terms of its conservation. So at this point, I hope, on the basis of these considerations, on the basis of these factors, I hope it's evident that any contingent being requires a necessary being to adequately explain it. If you don't have a necessary being, then reality becomes unexplained and unintelligible. Or I should say inexplicable and unintelligible. You need a necessary being to make sense of things. You need a necessary being for the world to cohere, for reality to have consistency to it. So I think this is a strong argument. I think it makes sense. I don't think there are any glaring weaknesses to it. And so this is one of my favorites. I think if you think it through carefully, I think it's very compelling, and I think it does make a difference, or it can make a difference at least, to people that are willing to thoughtfully consider it.
What is the strongest atheist objection to this argument which you've encountered? And then maybe how would you go about answering that objection?
Well, there are a couple things I'll mention. So there are people who would quickly reject the PSR. Okay, so the PSR, like I said, that's the principle of sufficient reason. That's the idea, once again, that everything has a sufficient explanation. Everything has a reason for why it exists. And there are people who would reject that, and they would claim that maybe things can just possibly pop into existence. Okay, I mean, how would you prove otherwise, right? Maybe there can be things that exist without any explanation. However, what I would say in response to that is that the actual behavior of these people that would raise this objection indicates that they don't actually doubt the principle. Okay, like I said, this is something that all people take for granted. You see it in their daily lives. You see it in how they do everything. They always assume that there's an explanation for things. So this doubt would reveal, or this objection would reveal an inconsistency on their parts. And I do think it's important for us as rational beings to seek consistency. I know that, when I was talking about presuppositionalism, I was criticizing them in some ways for their overemphasis on consistency, I think. But certainly consistency is important, and it's something that we should strive for. So I certainly agree with that. And I would say that if you are embracing this objection to this argument, and it's causing you to be inconsistent in what you claim or in what you believe or in how you act, then I would say that is a problem. I would say that has, there's an integrity issue there. So I do think it's really important that we are consistent. And I think if you can't reject theism without being very inconsistent, I think that's a problem. And I think you should acknowledge that that's a problem. It's also true that if we reject the PSR, then we're opening the door to skepticism, because what that means is that our beliefs could exist without any cause or reason. Okay, any of our beliefs could have just popped into existence too. And so we might believe things, we might think we have good reasons for believing them, but they could be false because our beliefs could have no cause. Okay, so if you're willing to entertain this idea, then I think skepticism follows. I do think that these things go hand in hand. So if we're going to have an intelligible world, if we're going to have reliable beliefs, justified beliefs, then we need to accept the truth of the PSR. So I don't think you can avoid the argument by rejecting the PSR, because I just think it costs too much. The consequences are too great for rejecting the PSR. But there's another objection that I think also we should talk about. And that is that one could say that the necessary being that I've been talking about, they could say that it's not obvious that that being is God. It's not, they would say, why should I assume that this necessary being that you're talking about is God? Perhaps the necessary being could be like an impersonal force or a law of nature of some kind, right? So they're going to say, there's a lot more to God than just being necessary. So how does positing a necessary being get us to God? And in response to that criticism, I would want to mention something called the principle of proportionate causality. So this is another principle with a long name that probably sounds like something hard to understand, but it's really not. Okay, it's called the principle of proportionate causality, and I think if we employ this principle, I think it can help us to understand why the necessary being that I've been talking about, that everything contingent depends upon, why that being has to be God. So what the principle of proportionate causality it's basically a correlate or an implication of the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, it's closely connected to the principle of sufficient reason. And what it states is that, excuse me, whatever is in an effect as a quality or an attribute has to, in some sense, pre-exist in whatever causes have given rise to it. Okay, so if something is in an effect, it has to be somewhere in its cause in some sense. The cause has to have it in some way, has to possess it. Another way of putting this is that a cause can't give what it doesn't have. Okay, a cause can't give what it doesn't have. If it's going to be an adequate explanation or an adequate reason for something, then it has to have what it takes to produce the effect. Okay, if the cause is lacking something, it's not going to show up in the effect. You can't get something from nothing. Okay, that's basically what this principle is affirming. You can't get something from nothing. But how a cause can have something can vary. Okay, so it might have it formally, which means that it actually has the same property or attribute that it gives to the effect. So for example, fire has heat, right? Fire is hot, and fire conveys heat to whatever it is in close proximity to. So it has heat itself, and it gives heat to its effects. But it's also true that causes can virtually possess what's in their effects. And what this means is that the cause doesn't have the attribute, doesn't have the property that it gives to the effect, but it has the power or the ability to produce it. Okay, so a boxer, for example, can give an opponent a headache without having one himself. Okay, he has the virtually possesses that headache in the sense that he has the power to produce the headache in something else, but that doesn't mean that he has to have it himself. And it's also true that a cause can eminently possess what is in the effect. And with this word eminence, we want to indicate something transcendent or something above and beyond what is in the effect. So in this case, it possesses the attribute in a certain sense, but in a much higher or more perfect way than in the effect. So for example, God possesses goodness, and God bestows goodness on creatures, but God's goodness is infinite, and so it's perfect, and all creaturely goodness is finite and limited in different ways. So, like I said, 3 ways in which a cause can have what's in the effect. Okay, formally, virtually, or eminently. Now, I think that the PPC is true because, like I said, I think it makes sense to think you can't get something from nothing. Okay, the cause has to be able to produce what's in the effect. I think that's just common sense, right? And when you're doing apologetics, it's always important to adhere closely to common sense. You have to abide by the rules of human thought. You have to abide by what comes naturally to human beings. Because if you're going to make a case for something, it can't be too weird. It can't be too counterintuitive. You need to stick closely to common sense. So I think just like the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, I think that embodies common sense. So that's totally in accord with common sense. I would say the same thing is true of this principle of proportionate causality, or the PPC. I think both of these are common sense principles that we need to believe and we need to accept if we're going to make sense of reality, if reality is going to be intelligible to us. So I want to call our attention to is that in the universe, there are personal beings, and these personal beings have intelligence and volition. So looking at ourselves, looking at human beings, we see that we have beings with minds that have intelligence and volition. And what this indicates is that the ultimate cause of these things is also going to have to possess these attributes. Okay, intellect and volition are going to be in that necessary being in either a formal, a virtual, or an eminent way. Now, let's look at these options quickly. I don't think it makes sense to say he's going to be very, very different than his effects. Okay, the necessary being is going to have attributes that no creature does. His intellect and will are obviously not going to be comparable to ours. It's not going to be a difference in degree. Okay, so I don't think it makes sense to say that the necessary being that I've been talking about has intellect and volition in a formal way, or it doesn't have these attributes that humans have in a formal sense. I also don't think it makes sense to say that he possesses them virtually. Okay, that would mean that the necessary being produces things with volition and intellect, but doesn't have them himself or itself. Okay, it doesn't have these attributes. And the problem with this is that it's very hard to see how this could be the case. You know, you'd have to be saying that a being without intellect is causing things to exist with intellect. Okay, this is one of the problems with like a materialist theory of the universe in general, right? And if you're going to accept like a Darwinian picture of things, you have to say that a material universe is somehow producing things with intellect. And that's very, very hard to explain in any kind of cogent or believable way. But the same issue is present here when talking about this argument. How could a being without intellect cause something to exist without intellect? I don't think it could. Okay, that would be like order coming from nothing but chaos. It'd be like spirit coming from nothing but matter. It just doesn't make sense to think that an ultimate cause could possess personal attributes in this way. So I don't think we can say that the necessary being only has them virtually. I think he has to have them in some kind of real sense. So what we're left with is that the ultimate cause has to have these attributes of intellect and volition in an eminent way. And I think this is what reason and scripture both seem to suggest is the right answer. So the Lord tells us in Isaiah 55 that his thoughts are not our thoughts and his ways are not our ways, right? He says that his ways infinitely transcend our ways and his thoughts infinitely transcend our thoughts. And so it seems to me that if we're going to talk about him having intellect and volition, it has to be in an eminent way. So we're going to say that he does have these attributes, but in a way that is analogous to our possession of them. Okay. One of the things that I appreciate about Thomism is this idea of analogical attribution. Okay. The idea that God possesses attributes in a way that is like ours in some respects, but also very, very different. And I think that that's something we need to insist on if we're going to think properly about God and understand his transcendence correctly. So just to sum up, I do think that the principle of proportionate causality makes it clear that the necessary being that we've proved with this argument does have to have personal qualities, does have to have intellect and will. And so if we have a necessary being that also is intelligent and also has will and makes, does things, makes decisions, then I think we have God. I think it totally makes sense to think that this argument has proved that the creator of the scriptures exists.
One of the most popular arguments against the existence of God, which normally in a lot of these discussions, at least when it comes to classical apologetics or evidential apologetics, you have the Christian making the positive case, and then you have the atheist simply trying to explain why that's just not compelling. Or, you have some atheists like Matt Dillahunty who think that simply saying, "Well, I'm not convinced," is a response to these arguments. But in the rare instance, you actually have like a few arguments that the atheist may try to actually defend and make a positive case for the non-existence of God. And one of those arguments is the problem of evil. I would actually say it's probably the most popular argument for the non-existence of God is the problem of evil. And so could you maybe explain what the problem of evil is, and then we'll go from there?
Yeah, exactly. So you're right that the problem of evil is the biggest problem for theism, at least in terms of how commonly it's raised and how often people appeal to it for why they don't believe in God. A lot of people think it kind of like wipes out the significance of any of the arguments we've been talking about. You can have a theistic proof, but if you have the problem of evil, then it kind of counteracts it or, counterbalances it. And so you're left with agnosticism, right? You're left with some kind of state of indecision where it's not clear what perspective has the most going for it or which perspective is the most credible. So it's very important that theists have a response to the problem of evil. And that theists have thought carefully about, how to answer this objection. There are two forms of the problem of evil that I think are worth discussing or worth mentioning. One is often called the traditional or the logical problem of evil, and then the other is called the evidential problem. And the traditional problem, I think, is the one that people most often think about when they think about the problem of evil. And this is basically an argument for the conclusion that God can't exist. Okay, because of evil, God can't exist. And the evidential problem is an argument for the conclusion that God's existence is unlikely. It's unlikely or improbable. So the traditional problem, it goes like this. And we probably, most people have probably heard this before or have thought about this before, but it runs like this. If an almighty and all good God exists, then evil would not exist, since God would be powerful enough to prevent it and good enough to want to prevent it. Okay, if you have an all good, all powerful God, well, why evil? Evil shouldn't exist. But evil does exist. There is evil in the world, so therefore God doesn't exist. Okay, so like I said, it's pretty much just a deductive argument for the conclusion that God is not real because of evil. And I'd say the reasoning here appears valid. I think this is a valid argument. So if we want to undermine the argument, we're going to have to show that at least one of the premises is dubious or untrue. Okay, that's how you deal with an argument where the logic appears to be good. You have to attack the premises, and you have to show that those premises are unfounded. So Christians are not going to want to call into question the premise that evil exists. All right, there are some religions that do that, but that's not a Christian option. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to call into question the premise that asserts that an almighty and all good God would prevent all evil, right? And the way that we would do this, or the right way to approach this, is by finding a reason for why God might allow evil. If we can find a reason for why God might allow evil, then we can show that it's untrue that God would prevent all evil, because there might be a reason for allowing it or permitting it. And the evidential problem goes like this. It says, given how many horrific things are happening in the world without any obvious purpose or reason or benefit, it seems likely that there are pointless evils. Okay, there are gratuitous evils that serve no purpose. And what the objector is going to say is that an almighty and all good God would not allow pointless evils. Right? If God really cares about the world, if God is really involved in governing the world, God's not going to be allowing bad things to happen for no reason. So therefore, God probably does not exist, at least not the providential, loving God of the Christian tradition. So with this form of the argument, what we have to assess is this contention that it's likely that some evils are pointless. Okay, and we would have to argue against that contention. So that's basically a rundown of how these arguments work.
And so, what are some of the different responses that Christians have historically given to the problem of evil? And then, what is your favorite response?
So there are 4 responses that I think are worth mentioning. There's the free will response. There's the soul-making response. There's what I call the glorification response. And then there's what I would call the inscrutability response. And some of these are my preferred terms. Other people would call them other things. But I think these 4 responses are quite common. They're quite popular. And I think that it's good to think about them and figure out which ones are strongest, because obviously if you're dealing with a skeptic, you're dealing with somebody who has doubts, you want to have the best response that you can, and you want to have one that's consistent with the rest of your theology. That's important too. I think, sometimes, apologetics needs to be molded to your confession. And a lot of evangelical apologetics are kind of free floating, and they're not really tailored to a Lutheran point of view. So it's important that when Lutherans do apologetics, they think about whether or not they can actually use these things that evangelicals are putting forward or Catholics are putting forward. A lot of times they can. A lot of times it will be helpful stuff, but not always. And so we need to be aware of the assumptions that are behind these positions and these arguments, and we need to make sure that they are consistent with what we believe. So the first one I want to talk about is the free will response. And this is, unsurprisingly, probably obvious to most people, this is the most popular reason, I think, given for why God permits evil, is to appeal to free will. This response has a long history in the church. Christians have been using it for a very long time. I think the most famous early expression of it is probably found in St. Augustine's book on the free choice of the will. But even before then, I think there were church fathers that were appealing to free will as a response to this problem. And the relevant assertion here is that God wanted us to have the ability to make genuine choices, and this freedom came with the possibility, of course, that people would choose the wrong things. And many Christians think that this is an adequate response. A lot of people find it easy to understand. And so I think that explains a lot of its popularity. If you were to ask a random sample of Christians from different denominations why God allows evil in the world, I think a significant number, a majority, would say something about the value or the importance of free will. God wanted us to have free will. God wanted us to be free to choose good or evil. But we have to ask, of course, is this an option for us as Lutherans? Because one of our most famous theological works is called The Bondage of the Will. Okay, and you ask Lutherans about free will, oftentimes you will get a downvote. Okay, you'll get a negative response. No, we don't like free will. We don't believe in free will, because we do believe that God works salvation. We don't believe that salvation is something that we choose for ourselves. But contrary to some popular misconceptions, Lutherans don't deny the existence of free will entirely. Okay, so Lutherans are not against free will altogether. What we're going to say is Adam was free to sin or not to sin. Adam had that freedom. We're going to say that unbelievers have freedom to choose how they're going to sin. They can also choose to avoid outward sins. Okay, they can certainly be upright people. They can follow the laws and so forth. And we're going to say that believers have the freedom to sin or not to sin. So just like Adam had the freedom to sin and not to sin, believers who have been regenerated by the Spirit, they also have the ability to sin or to refrain from sinning. So, in fact, we're going to say that human beings have free will. They have to have free will in some sense, because Lutherans refuse to say that God is the author of sin. Okay, we refuse to say that God is responsible for sin. We refuse to say that God is responsible for people resisting him or refusing him. We refuse to say that God is responsible for who is condemned. We're going to lay that all on the account of human beings. We're going to say that human beings are responsible for all those things. And for that to be the case, we're going to have to say that human beings have some responsibility for what they do. And so we're going to have to, attribute some kind of freedom to them. We're going to have to say that they have some kind of free will. Now, how God's providence can be compatible with our freedom, that's a difficult question. That's a mysterious question that Christians have been considering for 2,000 years now. And there's a variety of answers to that. But there's no good reason to think that we can see things clearly enough to know that there's some kind of incompatibility. Okay, so we don't need to believe that God's providence or God's government of the world and our freedom, we don't need to believe that those are incompatible. We can believe they're consistent in some way, even if we're not sure how that is. We should understand that we're finite and limited in what we can know, and so we should just submit ourselves to the voice of Scripture and to the words of Scripture. And Scripture says we're responsible for sin, and it says that God's in charge of everything and God controls everything. Then we should accept both things. And if we can't discern how they fit together, then we should just chalk that up to our own shortcomings. That's, I think, the best way to approach this issue. So, in short, or in sum, Lutheranism has a pretty nuanced view of free will. Okay, I think it adheres closely to the teaching of Scripture. We're going to say that when it comes to conversion, when it comes to justification and faith and so forth, we're going to say that's all the work of God. We're going to say that doesn't have anything to do with us. But when it comes to sin, we're definitely going to lay that at our doorstep. We're definitely going to say that the sin, the unbelief, the resistance, that all is due to our free choice. Okay, so we are going to affirm both things. So that being so, just getting back to the issue of evil, it may seem that free will can do the job that we need it to give us a reason for why God permits evil. But there are some problems with this response still, or some remaining problems that I think we should know. So for one thing, the free will response doesn't seem to account directly for natural evils. Okay, natural evils would be things like illnesses and natural disasters. Okay, if we tell a skeptic that evil exists because of free will, they're probably going to ask us how free will explains tornadoes, right? How does it explain cancer and so forth? But this is not an unsolvable difficulty. It's not something that we have no response to, because we do believe that natural evils are ultimately the result of moral evils. Okay, we believe that natural evils are the result of Adam's sin and the curse that was placed upon creation as a result of the fall. And it's also possible that at least some natural evils are caused by the actions of evil spirits. Okay, this is an idea raised by Alvin Plantinga in his book on free will and evil. Okay, there could be evil spirits that are choosing to do things, and that's causing these natural evils. So the natural evil in this sense would be derivative or would be caused by a moral evil. So if we're going to assume that Christianity is true, we're going to assume there was a fall, we're going to assume there are evil spirits. Natural evils can be accounted for by appealing to moral evils or to bad deeds. But obviously skeptics are generally going to be unwilling to accept these kinds of theological beliefs. They're already a skeptic. We're oftentimes struggling just to convince them that God is real. So the idea that Adam was real and there was a fall, or the idea that there are evil spirits, that's going to be a hard sell for people in this situation. Okay, they're probably going to find these explanations far-fetched. But at the very least, I think these things show that a response to the problem of evil based on free will is defensible. Okay, you can come up with a consistent response to the problem of evil based on free will that I think is, at least in large part, compatible with Lutheran theology. So I think the free will can provide an adequate defense against the logical or the traditional problem of evil. It can show there's no incompatibility between the existence of God and the existence of evil. But that all being said, I still think that this is not the best way of responding to the problem of evil. So one of the things that I find problematic about it is that it seems debatable to me that human freedom is such a great good that it would justify permitting evil. Okay, it seems unclear to me that that would be something that God would say, because I want you to be free, I'm going to allow you to do evil things. Okay, many people do think so. And some people would even claim that the goal of Christianity is for people to love God and that true love requires freedom. So they would say that freedom is a necessary ingredient in Christianity. And since God's end is for people, to love him, that it would make sense for him to allow freedom, even at the cost of evil. They would say that, if we didn't have freedom, we couldn't really love God. There's a Christian philosopher named Paul Herrick, and he says something like this. He writes the following. He says, God allows suffering caused by the creaturely misuse of free will because the gift of free will is a necessary condition for God's ultimate goal, which, Scripture assures us, is that human beings will one day freely enter into an eternal and loving relationship with their Creator in the next life in heaven. Without free will, a loving response to God would be impossible, for creatures would be robots, incapable of real love. So often that word robot oftentimes appears in these discussions. The concern is that, we wouldn't be fully human if we didn't have freedom. And God wants us to be fully human. God wants us to respond to him in an authentic and genuine way. And so the idea is that we can't have determinism when it comes to these things. And so freedom is necessary. The possibility of evil is necessary if God's going to realize his ends or realize his goals. Now, what Herrick says, I think here, it probably sounds plausible to some people, but I think he is mistaken, and I'll explain why. So for Lutherans, at least, it's clear that people don't have the freedom to be spiritually reborn. Okay, our being believers, loving God, these are not things that we chose to do. These are not things that we can take responsibility for. Okay, so our being spiritually reborn, our choosing to place our trust in Christ, these are things that God himself has done. These are things that God himself has worked in us. And it's also true that there will be no freedom to do evil in heaven. Okay, so not only is our decision or our belief in God, not only is that taken out of our hands, and it's something that God himself decides, it's something that God himself does, but when we get to heaven, we're not going to have the freedom to choose to turn away from God. We're not going to have the freedom to do evil in heaven. So the claim that the freedom to choose God or turn from him is something that we would be a lot worse off without, I don't think that's self-evidently true. And I think, our heavenly existence kind of calls that into question. There's also this idea that we saw in the Herrick quote that love requires an ability to freely choose the beloved. So you can't have real love without freedom, without free choice. And I think that's an assumption that's far from obviously right. And a good counterexample to it, I think, is the Trinity, right? So the persons of the Trinity all love each other. They love each other perfectly. They love each other in the best way possible, in a way that transcends our comprehension and our ability to understand. And yet none of them are free to abstain from loving the others, right? None of them can opt out. So the persons in the Trinity, they love each other with a love that surpasses anything that we can imagine, and yet there's no freedom there. There's no, at least in the sense of like being able to do otherwise. I'm not saying they don't want to love, they certainly do, but they don't have the freedom to do otherwise. And so I think that this provides a good reason to think that this idea that love and freedom have this necessary connection, in the sense that, Herrick and others would say that they do, I think that's highly questionable. And then one other thing I'll say is that I think that the free will response actually seems to lack biblical support. So, Herrick, in that passage I read, he suggests that free will is something that the Bible supports, but I don't think that's true. So one never sees Scripture saying that God permits evil because he values human freedom. Okay, one will never find a passage that suggests that. Scripture says that God created and governs this world for his own glory, not for the sake of something in man. So the free will response, therefore, it seems pretty anthropocentric to me. It seems anthropocentric, and I don't think it can be squared with a scriptural perspective. As far as us being robots goes, what I would say to that is that God can be glorified by any of his creatures. Stars glorify him, sunsets glorify him. He doesn't need things to be freely choosing to have a relationship with him in order to be glorified by them. He can be glorified by what we are and by what we say and do regardless. So if God's glory is his principal end, if that is the end for which he creates, then free will probably not be the primary reason for why he permits evils, because glory doesn't require freedom. Okay, I don't think love requires freedom, like I just said, at least in the sense of being able to do otherwise. And I don't think glory requires freedom either. So given these considerations, I don't think the free will response has that much to recommend it. I think we should look for other possibilities. We should consider the other options. So another option is the soul-making response that I mentioned. And a lot of people connect this to the church father Irenaeus and the things that he said about the human condition and about human maturation. With this response, what we're basically saying is that God allows suffering because it makes possible the growth and development of certain admirable character traits that couldn't exist in a world without them. Couldn't exist in a world without suffering. Okay, so we need suffering we need adversity to develop traits like courage, compassion, patience, generosity, and so forth. If we didn't have hardships, we wouldn't develop these traits. Now, I think this response has some value in that it does appear true that there are certain good qualities, certain virtues that would not naturally arise without the experience of adversity, right? It's true that if you don't ever experience hardship, you're not going to develop certain traits, at least not under normal circumstances. And Scripture also tells us that trials are for the good of believers. So in Romans 5, Paul says that sufferings produce perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. So it's clear that there's some kind of connection between suffering and personal growth. Okay, growth in virtue, growth in maturity, and growth in wisdom. So that's all true. But I don't think that this response necessarily works well as an adequate explanation for why God allows evil in general. So for one thing, there doesn't seem to be any reason why virtues couldn't be supernaturally created by God if he wanted to cause them in this way. So I mentioned, hardship is necessary for these virtues to increase naturally. If we want to have them in a natural way, or if we're going to acquire them in a natural way, we do have to experience difficulties. We do have to experience opportunities to exercise these virtues. But I don't see why God couldn't cause them instantaneously in a supernatural way, or why he couldn't just create people with these virtues. It's not clear to me why the struggles are a necessary ingredient in this, why people have to go through these trials and tribulations. You can be patient and you can have courage without actually needing to be in situations where those virtues are tested. You can certainly have those attributes without being in dangerous situations or being in trying times. And it's also true that in heaven, many people are going to have virtues that they never had on earth, and that they don't have any opportunity to exercise in heaven because there's not going to be any evil. So those things I was just mentioning, like courage and patience, I assume people in heaven are going to have courage and patience. I assume that those are attributes that they would have. They would have those virtues, but obviously there's not going to be a need for them in heaven. People aren't going to have them in order to deal with evils, because there won't be any evils around. A lot of people are going to have lots of qualities in heaven that they never had on earth. Okay, if you're perfected when you go to heaven, obviously that means that you're going to have lots of qualities that as a human being on earth you did not have, or you had in a very like inchoate form, right? A very kind of immature form. And those things are all going to be perfected in heaven. So by supernatural means. So I think this makes it clear that we don't have to go through these hardships in order to have these qualities. And if we don't have to go through these things to have these qualities, it's not clear how this provides an explanation for why God permits evil. Okay, it doesn't seem to shed much light on that, if that's the case. And then another issue is that this explanation, again, it seems pretty anthropocentric to me. I don't think Scripture gives us a basis for thinking that God permits evil chiefly so that people can acquire some quality. And that's kind of a byproduct of the evils that they experience. I think Paul is giving encouragement to people. He's saying, even though you're going through these things, you don't have to you can look at the bright side. You can see some kind of positive result or outcome. These things are allowing you to grow spiritually. These things are allowing you to grow morally and so forth. So you should see these trials and these tribulations as opportunities. I think that's what Paul is doing. He's giving encouragement. But I don't think he's providing a basis for thinking that God's permitting evil for these reasons. God's permitting evil so that you can grow in patience and so forth. So I don't think the soul-making response, I don't think it's the best. Just like the free will response, it seems too anthropocentric to me. And I don't think it has a really good scriptural grounding. So I think, the last two that I'm going to talk about, glorification and inscrutability, I think are much better. And I'll explain why right now. Glorification response. This one affirms that God allows evil so that his wisdom and his goodness and his power are going to be made manifest by how he uses and overcomes evil. So God will be glorified by how he responds to the evil in this world. And I think Scripture teaches that God does act for his glory. I think that's very clear. You look at the Psalms, you look at Isaiah, Romans, Ephesians, you will find passages that explicitly say that God does things so that he will be glorified. And it seems to me that anything that glorifies God, anything that contributes to glorifying God, is justifiable. So I would say that if God is able to use evil to bring glory to himself in order to display or manifest his glory, then his permitting evil is justified. He can allow evil to exist to demonstrate to all of his creatures his ability to answer it and rectify it. Now, I think if we look at Scripture, I just mentioned some places where it talks about how God acts for his glory. But I think there are also stories in Scripture that illustrate this, that illustrate the fact that something evil happened or something bad happened, and as a result, God was greatly glorified by it. So one of the examples would be the story of Joseph and his brothers. Okay, so God allows Joseph to be sold into slavery. He allows him to be taken to Egypt and so forth. But because of what happened later on, his family is saved, during a time of famine, and many others are kept alive because of what God did. So Joseph's suffering, it enables God to save many people and display his wisdom, display his foresight, display his control over creation. So God is glorified by the evil that happened to Joseph. And then another example is the raising of Lazarus in the New Testament. So in John, Jesus actually explicitly says that Lazarus got sick for the glory of God. Lazarus was allowed to die so that God would be glorified through what happened to him. And he says that, I didn't go to heal him earlier because I wanted you to see this great miracle I'm going to do, because I wanted you to believe that I'm the Messiah. So God permits Lazarus to die precisely so that this great miracle will be done and people will understand Jesus's power and will understand God's goodness. So I think that's another great example of something evil befalling someone and God being glorified by it. And then the crucifixion too. This is probably the best example of all. So, of course, God is part of God's plan and part of his foreknowledge that Jesus is going to be crucified, that Jesus will be killed. And yet Jesus's death, that means life for the whole world, right? The suffering of Christ ensures the greatest victory that one could imagine. The cross, even though it's extremely shameful, it brings great glory to God. Okay, God saves and rescues the whole world through that horrible crime, okay, through that horrible evil. In Romans, Paul says that God has consigned all to disobedience that he could have mercy on all. And I think what that suggests is that God permitted the fall so that there would, afterwards or following that, he would be able to perform this great work of redemption. God would be able to perform this great work of redemption that would make his love and his mercy and his power and his goodness clear. So I think all of these things suggest that God's glory is a good reason for permitting evil. It's a good reason for God allowing evil to happen. I think it's scriptural. I think it's a theocentric response. It's not an anthropocentric response like the other two that we were talking about. So God permits evil so that he's recognized and revered as God through through the way that he responds to it. Now, there are obviously ways that people might object to this that I think some people might think of at least. There are a lot of things that happen that we can't see a good reason for. And there are a lot of things that happen that's not obvious how God is or could be glorified by them. And we see a lot of very wicked things in our world, a lot of things that are horrific, a lot of things that disgust us. And, we can see these things and we can wonder, what is God doing? Allowing this world to exist in the way that it does, allowing it to drag on in its current state. It may seem like this is a really strange way for God to bring glory to himself. So if he's wanting to glorify himself through what he does, why is he permitting all of these things to happen that are just atrocious, and making it look like his government of history is actually, being very poorly performed or very poorly done. It may seem like he's an absentee father, right? Who's not actually overseeing anything. So the state of the world can make it seem like, it's a strange thing that God is permitting evil to bring glory to himself because evil seems so out of control, right? So evil seems like it doesn't seem like it's being managed. It doesn't seem like it's being administered in the way that one might expect. But I think we need to realize that the history of the world is a story. Okay, it's a story that we find in the scriptures, and with any story, the ending is the most important part. Okay, the ending decides or determines the true meaning of everything that came before. And if Christianity is true, then the ending is going to feature this very dramatic reversal, this unprecedented reversal of everything that happened before. And so all of these horrible things, all these atrocious things, these heartbreaking things that we've been talking about, all these things that we're so familiar with, unfortunately, those are all going to end, and they're going to be replaced with a world of everlasting peace and joy due to what happened on the cross. And I think it's hard to imagine a better ending to a sad story. It's hard to imagine a more dramatic coda to a world in which for so long things have been dragging on in this miserable way. Okay, we've been wretched and miserable for so long, but yet there's this glorious ending promised to us. And I think that when we see that great reversal, when we see that amazing contrast, that will glorify God in a way that's hard to imagine. Okay? I don't think there would be anything that could bring more glory to God than just seeing how he is finally able to resolve all of these problems, all of these difficulties, all of these sins, all of these great evils that we see around us and that oftentimes don't seem to be fixed or don't seem like they're being addressed by God's providence. But if he takes all those things and he is able to complete this great tapestry, able to complete this great picture of the history of the world that he has been constructing. And he is able to resolve all of these things, which Scripture promises us that he will. Then nothing will glorify him more than that. So the fact that he's allowed a great amount of evil, that certainly might seem like a strange way for him to glorify himself. But if he is able to take that great evil and defeat it and answer it and respond to it in a way in which it's, completely resolved, then his glory will be, impeccable and unmatchable at that point. So I do think that the history of the world is as difficult as it is for us to understand or to wrap our minds around. It doesn't show that God's glory is not his end. It doesn't show that God's glory is not his aim and is not the reason for why he's permitting evils. I think it's also true that when it comes to how particular events serve God's glory, we have to recognize our limitations as knowers. Right? So we have a very narrow perspective on the universe. We have a very narrow perspective on human history. And we often can't know how things that happen today, how they're going to affect events a year or a century from now, let alone at the end of the world. And it seems certain to me that we're not going to understand how God is glorified by many things until we're in heaven. Okay, but if Scripture is true, then it seems clear to me that at least in some way or other, all things are going to glorify God. Paul says in Romans, that all things work together for good to those who love God. And I think that everything that works good for his people is certainly going to bring him glory. So even though there's a lot of things in our world that, we can't understand how they're working together for good, we can't understand what positive outcome could possibly come from them. We need to trust that God is at work, that God is managing and governing everything in a way that is suitable given his ends, and that at some point we will see the finished picture. We will see how this all came together or all fit together in this great work or in this great tapestry, and we'll see how it all glorifies him. So that's the glory response. I do think it's a good one. Like I said, because I think it's scriptural, because I think it's theocentric. I think that those two things make it better than the other two that I mentioned. There's also one that I mentioned called the inscrutability response. And this is related to the last point that I just made when talking about glorification or God's glory. What the inscrutability response is going to say is that we don't need to know the reason for why God permits evils. We're going to say that nobody can prove there isn't a reason, and we shouldn't really expect to understand God's mind. We shouldn't expect to understand his plan. We shouldn't expect to understand the motives that he has in creating and governing the world. So in contemporary philosophical literature, people often refer to this as skeptical theism. That's the terminology that people use for this type of response, is skeptical theism. But I think that can be kind of confusing or lend itself to misunderstanding. So I prefer this inscrutability response terminology. We could also call it the Job response, because God, obviously, he doesn't give Job a reason for his suffering. And he makes it clear to Job that Job is out of line for even thinking that God owes him an explanation. So given how biblical this response is and how fitting it is, given God's transcendence and his incomprehensibility, I think this is a good way to address the problem of evil, is just to admit our limitations, to focus on how finite our perspective is. So unbelievers, of course, they might think this is just a way of kind of avoiding the problem or ignoring or bypassing it, right? They might think this is a really glib way of responding to the objections they have. Oh, you're just saying that you don't know and you shouldn't expect to know. Like, that just might sound too easy of an answer. But I think that if we think about it carefully, this is a very reasonable response. Okay, so one analogy we could use is a young child who doesn't understand his parents' actions. Okay, and when the child asks his parents what they're doing, they tell him that he's too young to understand, and that it would, in that case, If a child were told that, it would make sense for him, I think, to accept what they say at face value and to assume that they probably have good reasons for what they're doing. So the child would not be foolish in that case to take the parents at their word, that he's too young to understand and that what they're doing, there's a good reason for it. And in the same way, I don't think that Christians are foolish for taking God at his word. I don't think we're foolish for concluding with Job that we don't need to understand God's reasons for everything. There's a Christian philosopher that I really like named Peter Kreeft. He's a Roman Catholic, and he's written a lot of excellent books. He's had a long career. He used to be a Calvinist, and then he became a Roman Catholic, but he just has a very classical and very traditional way of thinking about philosophical issues and apologetic issues. And he co-wrote a book with a guy named Robert Tisselli, and it's an apologetics book that I think is very helpful. It's called Handbook of Christian Apologetics. But he says, if there is a God, his wisdom must be infinitely superior to ours, and we will not understand all his ways. This is the only answer Job got, and Job was satisfied, for he was a good philosopher. This posture is not blind fideism, but eminent reasonableness. Who are we, the players on the stage, to tell off the author of the play? How pitiful the sight of the pot trying to lecture the potter. We cannot explain the particular evils we see, but we can explain why we cannot explain them. In other words, we can point to our limitations, we can point to our finitude, and we can say that we shouldn't expect to understand God's ways. So I think that's a good response. And I think oftentimes it's going to strike people as probably more sincere or more authentic than trying to come up with some elaborate explanation that's based on speculation. I think sometimes it's best to just say, yeah, I don't know, but I'm comfortable not knowing because that seems like that's what I should expect. I should expect not to fully understand, or I should expect not to know why God does this or that, given who I am and given who God is, right? So if we properly understand ourselves and properly understand who God is, this is not a strange thing to think, right? This seems like Kreeft said, it's eminent reasonableness. It's not fideism. Fideism is, blind faith or believing things without good reasons. But this is believing something that is very reasonable to think. So thinking about all...
to your point with that as well, I mean, even with the child analogy, right? I mean, if someone says like, oh, it's blind fideism that you trusted your dad when he said that he had a reason for, I don't know, stopping your playtime early or whatever, right? No, the child actually has a relationship with his father, right? And he knows his father intimately. And it is because of this relationship and this encounter that he's had with his father that he trusts him when dad says, I don't know, hey, we got to cut this playtime short. I need you to go do this other thing, or we're going to go out, get in the car, and we're going to go do something, right? I guess if we keep the toddler analogy going, right, there are times, and I'm sure many people in the audience may have experienced this, or maybe, I don't know, they were a kid and they're upset, and dad is like, hey, I need you to come with me. We're not going to do playtime today. We're not going to do anything. I need you to get in the car. But why? Don't worry. We're headed somewhere. But why? Where are we going? What's happening? And perhaps, I don't know, there was a dentist visit or something going on that they needed to go do. But then also there's, I don't know, an ice cream.
Surprise visit to Chuck E. Cheese,
surprise
right?
at the end, right? Or something like this. Or there have been plenty of parents that say, hey, get in the car. Oh, why? I didn't want to do this. I just wanted to hang out in my PJs and watch cartoons or whatever. And mom and dad are like, get in the car. And then they end up, I don't know, going to Disney World. And again, these are analogies, right? All analogies break down. But this is something, I guess what I'm getting at here to help people at home understand as well is if the child trusts his parents and says, okay, I'm going to get in the car, but trusts his dad, this is because of the relationship that he has with his dad. And so his faith in his dad, his trust in his dad, his leaning on his dad's wisdom is not actually something that anyone would deride. I mean, in fact, right, I think the average person understands that when a toddler doesn't want to do anything his parents are saying and doesn't trust his parents, a lot of the time it's actually a very odious kind of toddler, right, that people don't really like. Right. And everyone's like, this is so unreasonable. Why are they acting this way? And it's because we have this understanding of, well, you need to defer to the one that has more understanding than you. And so if we understand that when it comes to a toddler and his dad, again, if we apply this analogy to God, I mean, how much more so for the God of the universe, to your point, whose mind is inscrutable, whose mind we cannot even begin to imagine the depths of, right? When it comes to his wisdom. And so something that I wanted to add to what you're saying as well is this very great article that my close friend and friend of the channel, he's been on here before, Cameron Brinkman, wrote on Substack called On God and Suffering. And he points this out as well, which is that ultimately this final response that you gave of God's inscrutability, it might seem to people to be very unsatisfying, but only if they're considering this in an abstract way apart from the cross, right? And so this is where, as Lutherans, we can bring in a little bit of this sort of like theology of glory versus theology of the cross, where this theology of glory, right, which seeks God in success and power, human achievement, understanding of why God is doing all these things, right, and viewing suffering as something to overcome, to avoid entirely. Whereas the theology of the cross, as Luther talks about it, finds God in weakness and in suffering and in failure, and recognizes ultimately that as a Cameron points out in his article, in the intimate domain of God, in the incarnation, the cross isn't something to be avoided. The cross is actually the Son's enthronement. And while standing in the shadow of the cross, there's no shade from suffering because the cross itself is suffering. Ultimately, there we find the God who suffers with us and who suffers for us and who knows what it's like to be rejected, who knows what it's like to be deserted at his hour of greatest need by his friends, right? Who knows what it's like to even take upon himself to drink the cup of God's wrath, right? He knows what it's like to be abandoned. He knows what it's like to go through all of these ordeals. And so it's because we know God, we have the revealed God in Jesus Christ, in the incarnation, because we know him in that same way, we can have this heartfelt confidence in him when he just says, trust me. And when it comes to Job, even right prior to the incarnation, but obviously in the Old Testament, everyone is looking forward to the Messiah and they're looking forward to this plan of God's redemption that is unfolding. With Job, as Cameron points out, citing Eleanor Stump, what transpires with Job at the end, right? For anyone that's not familiar with Job's story, I mean, the Lord allows Satan to take away all of Job. Job is this incredibly rich man. Satan takes away all his stuff in one fell swoop. He takes away all his things. He takes away his sons and daughters who were, meeting together, having lunch, and then Satan basically brings a whirlwind. House collapses on them. In one fell swoop, Job loses everything except basically his wife, who tells him, "Hey, why don't you curse God and die?" Right? And so Job is in this horrible place. His friends show up. And what's interesting, as Cameron points out in the article, is that his friends are actually trying to provide this theology of glory, right? Like, Job, I know why this happened to you. It happened to you because of this and this and this. And I know, Job, God wouldn't allow this to happen unless there was this thing at play. And I know exactly what it is, Job. And Job's friends are rebuked at the end. Because what is God's response, right? To, like you were mentioning, God shows up to Job and God begins asking all these questions that for a first-time reader of the book of Job might seem really weird, right? God doesn't show up and say, "Hey, by the way, Job, there's this thing that was going on in the background with Satan and Job. Here's all the reasons why I did this." God doesn't say any of that. God shows up and he just starts asking a bunch of stuff. And he asks Job things like, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when this happened? Job, are you aware of where I, store the rains in the heavens? Are you aware of all this minutia of how I run creation? Are you aware of any of this?" And God goes through this long line of questioning for Job and says, "Prepare to gird yourself up and answer me." And Job, at the end of it, we see why God loves Job so much, because his response after this, again, this second person encounter, as Cameron mentions it, that is incredibly meaningful to Job, right? With God expressing his wisdom, his delight in creation, and the fact that his wisdom and delight are unending. Job's response to that is to say that he repents. He says, "Lord, forgive me, for I did not know what I was talking about," right? "I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me," says Job. And then he repents in dust and ashes. And the Lord restores all these things to him by the end. And so what we see with Job there, I just wanted to help sort of bolster what you're saying, is when we talk about God's mind being inscrutable, it's not unsatisfying as long as we're looking at it through the lens of the cross. And as long as we're seeing a God who entered into history and who suffered alongside, by, and for us as well, and ultimately to save us unto his glory. It is when we see God, right, not in his hiddenness, in the God that is inscrutable, that we don't exactly understand. It is when we focus on the cross and this revealed God that suffers with us and has conquered death for us, that we actually can then say, you know what, I'm going to lean on God and I'm going to trust him, that there's an answer for this and that there are reasons for this. And that's why ultimately it's not unsatisfying to us, right? Because a lot of the time, as again, Cameron, once again, in his article points out, a lot of the time, even when people are trying to give like the logical problem of evil or whatever, the pressing question for the afflicted is not whether suffering as such is compatible with God's goodness, but whether my suffering is compatible with God's goodness. And ultimately, the answer for that is found at the cross. And that's where we need to go first. And then once we bolster that with these other answers that you've given, I think we find that our reason is not ultimately confounded, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we find that our faith prevails. And so, anyway, I just wanted to add that because it's Cameron just wrote this article. I've been reading it, and it goes well with what you're saying.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Those are all good points, and certainly ones that should be made. I think most of these responses I've been talking about, they are sufficient, I think, to show that this traditional problem is unsound. So this idea that God's existence is absolutely incompatible with evil, I think it's clear that that's untrue. It's clear that you cannot make that argument successfully. The mere existence of evil, it's not an argument for the impossibility of God's existence, or it's not the ground of an argument like that. And there's no reason to doubt that these reasons, or even other reasons that we haven't talked about, other unknown reasons, might give God sufficient grounds for permitting evil. So I think that's clear. I think humility is definitely the best course to take here. If you're a Christian, let's just remind ourselves of who we are and who God is, right? Let's just do what Job had to do. And I think if we do that, that will definitely help us to get through any doubts that we have or any trials that we're going through. I do think of the ones that I mentioned, I think the last two are the best. I think focusing on God's glory and on God's inscrutability, I think are good avenues to explore, are good routes to take. The first, because it makes God's glory his motive for allowing evil, and I think this motive is superior to freedom in creatures or the development of human virtue. And then the second, like I was just saying, it reminds us of the need for humility. We need to be humble in the face of God's wisdom. And I think a theocentric motive is always preferable to an anthropocentric motive, because I think that God should make himself the ultimate end of his acts. I think if we believe that we should always put God above creatures, and that we should always put greater goods above lesser goods and spiritual goods above earthly goods, then I think it makes sense for God to do the same and to act for his glory and to make it clear to all that he is the center of reality. He is the highest and the greatest and the best. God's love for creation is important. His goodwill towards creation, that's also a motive for what he does. But I think it makes sense to view love as directed to the ultimate end of his glory. So when it comes to God's love for creation and God's interest in manifesting or displaying his glory, I think it does make sense to subordinate the former to the latter. Some people might disagree with that, but I think especially with respect to this issue in particular, I think that has a lot to recommend it. The inscrutability response, I would also say it works really well against the evidential problem of evil. Okay, the evidential problem, just to remind anybody listening, that's the idea that there are pointless evils that happen, or at least it's likely that there are pointless evils, and so therefore it's improbable that God exists, right? And so belief in God is irrational because there are these things happening that don't have good reasons for them. But I think the inscrutability response is the perfect answer to that problem, because it tells us that we don't know enough about God's ends and his actions. We don't know about how everything is connected. We don't know enough about that to know that any evils are truly pointless. So just because something seems like it doesn't have a point or seems like it's not producing some kind of good result, that means very little given our limitations as knowers. So we shouldn't assume that evils are pointless. To do so is to beg the question, because there's not adequate grounds for thinking that. And so I think, in the end, we have to say that all of the evils that we experience are inconclusive with respect to this question of God's reality. So we do have the arguments for God's existence that are sound and do indicate that there is a creator. And then we have this other argument that is inconclusive, that doesn't actually prove anything. And so these things don't balance each other out. Like I was talking about, like the natural, the outcome is not, or it should not be agnosticism. It should not be like, well, I guess nobody can really know, right? We have the arguments for God's existence, which are sound. We have this argument against God's existence based on evil that is not sound, that doesn't prove what it sets out to prove. And so therefore they don't cancel each other out. It's still the case that it's more reasonable to believe in God than to not believe in God. I think the book of Job, that's essential reading. And, obviously the Bible is, the viewpoint of Scripture is that we should be believers. We should submit to God. We should place our faith in God. And I think the book of Job is a great example in there of how we should think about evil and why evil is not the kind of counter evidence to God's existence that the atheist or the skeptic would like it to be.
And another thing I'll mention as well, this is something that, again, like we said earlier, is important to bring up, is the atheist also isn't arguing from a vacuum, right? Like what is their response to the problem of evil, right? Because a lot of the time, I think the atheists just exist to try to poke holes in things. But the alternative vision that they have to provide is what? I mean, if there is no God, there's no moral lawgiver, right? Some of them try to rescue this idea of objective morality, but I think the average skeptic and atheist today understands, right? There's a reason why things in that realm of philosophy and stuff, why they trend toward subjectivism when it comes to this stuff. So what do they have to offer? I mean, ultimately they have to offer what? A world where there is no moral law, so therefore there is no evil, right? A world where if, say, I don't know, the Germans had won World War II, let's say, for instance, and they had taken over the entire world, and they were to succeed in all their efforts and all these monstrosities, and they had educated the populace so that everybody agreed that these monstrosities were good and were okay. In that world, right, if there is no God, there's no objective moral law, all that there is my opinion versus your opinion, would those monstrosities be okay? I mean, it seems anyway in their vision that would be the case. And so it's like, okay, well, what are they offering then? So they're offering ultimately subjectivism. They're offering something where there is evil, and even where there is, even if they don't want to talk about evil, they just want to say, fine, just suffering. Okay, great. In their vision, what? People continue to suffer, but there's no happy ending. Yeah. People suffer for no particular reason at all. Yeah, and it goes nowhere.
But no justice, no hope.
Yeah. Whereas in the Christian worldview, as you said it very well, I love, again, the sort of author analogy for God. God is ultimately writing the story where there is a happy ending, and a happy ending where all sad things come untrue. Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately the vision that we have to provide, not only is it logically satisfying when it comes to, again, being able to defeat the logical problem of evil, but also I think it's existentially satisfying, right? Because I think we all have this experience where we've all seen, whether it's something that happened to ourselves or within our family or friend group, or even something we've seen on the news, where there's this just unspeakable levels of evil that does actually happen. But what does the atheist have to say to that? Within their worldview, nothing, actually, right? In particular, at least. Nothing of any long-lasting significance anyway, right? It's just, I guess what? Try to make your own meaning, figure things out, but ultimately what? There's no justice, right? And so for us, we would say that things are trending toward justice, and that's a much more beautiful and lovely worldview anyway than what they have to offer. So
yeah. What they have to offer is not livable. Yeah.
No, it's not. Well, I mean, I have with my atheist friends, when I talk to them, and they'll say, morality is subjective. But what I always point out to them is, I'm like, man, I love you guys, but you don't actually believe that. You don't actually believe that. And what you get caught in is all sorts of, like you said earlier, performative contradictions, right? Where it's like you're saying, evil is subjective, but then if someone mugs you on the street, you're not just feeling like, it's my opinion that it was messed up, this happened to me. Like, no, there's a sort of like shaking your fist, like, something unjust just happened. Yeah, there's indignation to it. Or even, again, if they hear news of some sort of tragedy, maybe someone who, I don't know, some sort of murder or just this terrible thing that happened. My wife and I were watching a documentary yesterday at the time of filming with basically this, I think it's called Perfect Neighbor or something on Netflix, or like this lady basically shoots this other lady. And you have like, again, this completely senseless act of violence that escalated completely unnecessarily. And you have kids that are involved. And, in this documentary, like they're crying, they're grieving their mom. And I'm thinking like my wife kind of breaking down in tears watching this. And I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, so again, the atheist sees something like this, and because as Christians we would argue they are actually made in God's image, even if that image since the fall has been defaced in a sense. Still, the semblances that remain of the God's image in us, even as fallen creatures, sees this suffering, sees this injustice, and something within us clamors for justice. And there's an indignation that goes along with it. And so I think the moral relativist is only a moral relativist insofar as they remember to play the part. But when they forget to play the part, I think they fall back on moral realism and the fact that morality is actually objective. And so what we're offering is, well, hey, Christianity has a vision for why this actually is the case and where things are trending. So I think it's important to remember that, because sometimes people may get caught up in these arguments and forget that, like, well, they're talking to a human being too, and this human being presumably has to say something when it comes to evil and suffering, right? Otherwise, what are we doing here? So
right.
I just thought it's
so a human need is
mention.
for integrity and wholeness, right? We don't want to play different parts or have different roles or be wearing different masks. We want to have integrity and wholeness in how we think about things and how we live our lives. And if you can't live consistently with your beliefs, you need to change your beliefs.
Hey guys, I just want to take a quick second to shout out today's sponsor for our video, Just and Sinner. Just and Sinner is a confessionally Lutheran organization dedicated to bringing biblically faithful theological content to the world in an accessible and engaging way. They publish a wide range of books offering a classical Lutheran perspective on theology, philosophy, and culture. Their catalog covers topics such as dogmatics, ethics, church history, biblical studies, the devotional life, pastoral ministry, the Lutheran confessions, apologetics, cultural engagement, art, and politics. Practically, there's something there for everybody. Alongside new works for both popular and academic audiences, they also publish reprints of older texts, featuring updated formatting, new cover designs, and in some cases, even modernized language. Through their academic division, the Widener Institute, Just and Sinner also offers seminars, courses, and scholarly texts from modern Lutheran academics who engage contemporary scholarship and cultural challenges from a classical Lutheran lens. Over the years, I can say that I've gotten to know a few of the good people working over at Just and Sinner, and I can say that I've been truly edified by their work. In fact, not just their written works over there, but also the tremendously great work that is done over at the Dr. Jordan B. Cooper YouTube channel, which played a really big role in introducing me to Lutheranism and in helping me to really develop Lutheran convictions over time until I ended up, well, coming home to Wittenberg. And so I highly recommend that you guys please go check them out. Go get some of their stuff. I think you will be edified by it as much as I have been. You can learn more and explore their work over at justandsinner.org. Once again, that's justandsinner.org. Thank you for your time. Let's get back to the video. So, all right, well, having covered then sort of arguments for God's existence, trying to, at least give an introductory sort of response to the problem of evil here, to acquaint people to different answers to that. Let's then move on here as we're trying to kind of following this classical apologetics track to then questions of, Christianity specifically, right? Not just God in general, but Christianity specifically. What is the sort of basic case you would give to someone who doubts whether Jesus existed at all in order to convince them that he did in fact exist? Because we run into these people sometimes, right? You have Jesus mythicists, they're called, right, who say like, oh, Jesus is just this made up story and he didn't actually exist. So what are some of the sort of like basic facts you would give to someone who doubts Jesus's existence as a historical individual?
Well, I have to confess, this is never something that has actually troubled me personally. Like, I've never thought that this is like a reasonable thing to think. So I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about this. But what I would say is that I would point out that very few scholars have ever taken this idea seriously. Okay, regardless of what their background is or regardless of what they believe, very few have ever thought that this is a likely thing. And there's very good reason for that. So events in history, they of course require sufficient causes. We just talked about the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason. Things that occur in history also need sufficient reasons. And I don't believe a non-existent Jesus could possibly suffice to explain anything about the origin of the church, its message, the missionary zeal that you see in the early church, and its early writings. So if Jesus didn't exist at all, and somehow all of these things happened anyways, that would be really inexplicable. There would just be no analogy for that kind of a development anywhere in recorded history. And we also need to note that early disseminators of the Christian message, they wouldn't have had any motive for fabricating a Jesus. That just doesn't make any sense. Like, looking at where they are in their historical context and what could have possibly driven them to fabricate a Jesus, there's just nothing there. There's nothing intelligible about that whatsoever. And nobody would have believed them. Nobody would have believed their message if it hadn't been common knowledge in Palestine that Jesus had been a popular preacher who was crucified, right? So I don't think their message would have gotten anywhere, would have gained any ground if it was common knowledge, or that this person, there's no record of him. Okay, nobody knows who he is. Nobody's ever heard of him before. It's obviously he wasn't, as important or as significant a figure in the first century that, like, you had lots of pagan historians writing about him. There were some, but still, I think most people in Palestine at that time would have probably heard something about him. Okay, I think that he was a popular enough figure, and he was attracting enough crowds with his preaching that most people would have known who he was or would have heard of him. So this idea that they're, spreading this message about this person and claiming that he was a popular preacher, but nobody's ever heard of him, nobody has ever seen him, that's not realistic, right? That's unbelievable. Another thing that we can mention is that the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament, they don't read at all like mythical stories. Okay, if you've read ancient myths from any culture, they tend to be rather similar, and they tend to not have a lot of concrete detail. But you do find a lot of concrete detail in the Gospels. You even find things that would have been embarrassing for the early followers of Jesus. Okay, things that they probably would have preferred were not shared or did not happen, but those things are mentioned, and those things are presented. So there's a lot of good reasons for believing in the reality of Jesus and that he was a historical person. There's really no good reason to doubt that. I've never seen a good reason to think otherwise. So in sum, I would just say that this hypothesis is ludicrous, and even most atheists realize this, right? This view has, from time to time, it's gained a little bit of popularity here and there. I think in the early 20th century, there were some people that were advocating for it. And then today you have other people like Robert Price, who are also, I think, proponents of it. But the vast majority of people who have studied the Bible, who have studied antiquity, are convinced that Jesus was a real historical person. The atheists, most atheists are going to say, yeah, there certainly was a Jesus. Now they'll say that he was just a man, and they'll say that, his followers embellished his record or embellished his deeds, which I think is wrong, because I think Jesus did believe he was divine, and I think that the resurrection vouches for the rightness of his self-understanding. But my point is just that almost nobody who has given serious thought, serious time, serious attention to this thinks it's reasonable to think that there just was no Jesus, that Jesus was just fabricated or made up by his followers. I don't even know what you wouldn't call them followers. I guess you'd call them originators or creators or something. But nobody thinks that makes sense. A big part of it is just, like I said, there's the idea that their message would have gained ground or would have been credible to people at that time doesn't make any sense. The idea that they would have been motivated to do that doesn't make any sense, because these people were satisfied Jews. They were, I'm sure, happy enough being Jews. I'm sure they were looking forward to the Messiah, but they weren't people that were unhappy in the situation that they were in, and so that they needed to create a fake Messiah. It's not clear what purpose that would serve whatsoever. There's no earthly benefits that they would gain from it. There's no material benefits that they would gain from it. So this view, it just doesn't have anything, I think, to recommend it. And I think that if you think about these kinds of issues, it will become clear that it's much more reasonable to just have doubts about Jesus's divinity and things like that than it is to doubt that he ever existed. That's what I would say.
Well, especially because, and again, to summarize, like even some of the stuff that you mentioned here, or to add a little bit to this, I mean, there's all sorts of like embarrassing testimony and details, right? That if they were just fabricating a story out of whole cloth, you wouldn't really want to include these things in your story, right? I mean, this includes
you would want to make
like
yourself look good, right?
Yeah, exactly. You want to make yourself look
if you're
good,
a character in the story. I mean, that's another thing about this whole perspective. It's like, who is actually concocting all this? You know what I mean? Are the disciples real? Like, where does the fiction start?
Well, and again, we see in the story, I mean, we see all sorts of things like, well, Peter's denial of Christ, right? In Luke 22, we see the disciples hiding in fear of being found and executed by the same Jews who killed Jesus. We see the fact that Jesus' mother, the Mary Magdalene, and a few other women were the first to go to the crucifixion, while the disciples were running away and hiding, most of them, right outside of John. We hear about how it's the women who first show up and go to the tomb and find the resurrected Christ, right? And they see this empty tomb. And so a lot of these, and again, well, why would these last few be embarrassing? Well, in this culture at this point in time, right, where women's testimony was not highly regarded at all, and you needed the testimony of several women to equal to the testimony of one man, if you were concocting this story, or especially for the central event, as we're going to talk about here in a second, that is the resurrection, why would you mention the fact that it's women first who see this and who then tell the disciples, right, who are in hiding? We have details that might be embarrassing, or might come off embarrassingly, about Jesus, right, including like the fact that in Mark chapter 3, he was accused of being out of his mind and demon possessed. The fact that Jesus was executed like a common criminal on the cross. We have all sorts of things like this. I mean, we can sit here all day and discuss just these sort of embarrassing details. There's also the fact that, again, just like it's kind of funny because sometimes you have things that people will bring up to try to say like, oh, these are made up, they're not historical, and they'll bring up things like, well, look, in this gospel, when they're talking about this event, let's say, I don't know, Jesus healing a demon possessed man or doing some other sort of miracle, well, they mention X, Y, or Z people, and this other gospel only mentions person X, and this guy had these details and this person had these other details. And it's kind of funny because the same evidence that, or the same things that they produce as evidence against the historicity of the Gospels is actually evidence of their historicity when you look at that correctly. So, for example, I mean, when it comes to these questions of the various different details or levels of detail, as I'll say, that you see in a lot of these accounts, that actually makes a lot of sense if these are eyewitnesses, right? Or someone like Luke who's interviewing eyewitnesses, right? I mean, if you picture, let's say, if anyone who's watching has ever gone on vacation with their friends, especially if it was an extended vacation, and you went on this vacation with your friends or with extended family, and at the end of this extended vacation, someone were to ask a few of you, separate from one another, oh, what did you do over your trip, or what did you guys do? Odds are that as you're kind of recounting your story, okay, that some of you might mention an outing that others don't mention because it wasn't actually very remarkable to them. Some of you, let's say, I don't know, that let's say that you're talking, you have person A, and person A is talking, and they actually ran into someone who's like a shared acquaintance between person A and the person they're talking to. So they mentioned them. And then, well, a different eyewitness doesn't mention that person because they don't really care about it as much. People would have different focuses as they're telling the story of the vacation, the things that they found most remarkable to them. There would be details that some would include that others wouldn't. And this is something that we run into all the time when we're just talking with people, right? And especially something that, for example, even cops or detectives run into all the time when they're dealing with eyewitnesses, right? Different eyewitnesses mention different details. And it's something that makes a lot of sense when it comes to these being historical accounts. But then if someone doesn't think of it that way, they hear, oh, wait a second, all of these accounts aren't just like word for word the same, and they don't all have the exact same details. Oh, these must be made up. It's like, no, actually, that's a hallmark of historicity. It's a hallmark of people that are actually telling the truth, and they're conveying events that they've witnessed. In fact, it would actually be very suspicious as if all we had was word for word exactly the same thing, right? From gospel writer to gospel writer. Does that make sense?
That would make it sound like there was a conspiracy. at work.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Good. Great points.
So something maybe here I can mention, and again, we can deal with this maybe very briefly. It's the fact that many Jesus mythicists on the internet argue that Jesus didn't exist by claiming, oh, well, his story is just a rehash of older mythical stories, right? Like they'll say like Horus or Osiris. These guys were supposed to be like, or these figures rather were supposed to be like virgin born. They had disciples, performed miracles, resurrected after death. So the Jesus story is just a rehash of these. And again, it's just not a hypothesis that really any scholars take seriously, or any informed individual takes seriously, but it's one that's very popular on the internet. And so, what would you say to that? If you even want to deal with it, if not, we could skip it because I do have a playlist on it.
I'll give a few brief words in response. So first of all, like I said a moment ago, we have to ask, who was this creative genius who put all this together and orchestrated this? You know what I mean? Because that person is invisible to history. It's not obvious who that person could have possibly been. Who was it that convinced everybody to accept this fabrication? There's no sign of him. There's also, there's no evidence that Jesus's first followers knew much about mystery religions or had a strong interest in these things, had a strong interest in pagan cults and myths. There's no sign of that whatsoever. Everything points to the fact that their self-understanding was deeply Jewish and was steeped in the traditions and the scriptures of Israel. Like I said, they were satisfied Jews. There's no evidence that they were unhappy with their religion or unhappy with their worldview or any of those things. And another thing that we have to say is that these parallels that people talk about, they're always very superficial. And you can always find greater differences between the myths that supposedly inspired the Jesus tradition and the tradition itself. So the mere fact that there's some kind of analogy that you can find between these myths and Christianity proves nothing. Human beings, this is another important point to make here. Human beings are pretty similar, and they typically have the same needs, the same goals, fears, hopes, etc. So they're going to, across cultures, you're going to see some similarities. You're going to see analogies. People have claimed that all stories across cultures follow 6 or 7 basic plots. Okay. So all stories are pretty similar because they're told by human beings, and human beings are pretty similar. So whatever originality you can find anywhere in any culture, it's always going to be tempered by some similarities. There's always going to be some similarities in ideas and themes and images because we're all human, right? We all have a human nature, and we all think in relatively similar ways. So there's going to be these similarities. They don't, by themselves, they don't mean much. They don't signify much except for that common human nature that we all share. I'd also say the biographies of Jesus that we have in the Gospels, they're all situated in a specific historical context. There's realistic depictions of events. There's concrete detail, like I mentioned earlier. The myths of pagan religions, they lack this kind of realism. Okay, they clearly belong to a different genre. They're not the same thing. So unless there's some actual proof of borrowing that someone could furnish, all of this talk is just empty speculation. That's all it is. And I don't think a really critical thinker should take it seriously. There's just not sufficient warrant for that whatsoever. So that's what I'd say to that.
And in case anybody actually wants to see a much more in-depth response to these sorts of things, or wants to see a lot of the evidence, both internal to the Bible but also extra biblical evidence that Jesus existed, I do have a playlist on the channel with a bunch of these videos from other channels titled Jesus Exists, Jesus Mythicism Debunked. So people can go and check that out if they want more on that. Well, once we get past, there's this question of, well, did Jesus actually exist in history as a figure, which the average scholar, average person will just say, yes, of course he did. People will then have all these various different opinions about Jesus, right? Who was he? Was he someone who, as I believe Ben Shapiro has said in the past, like someone who's just a a revolutionary Jew who got killed for his trouble? Is he just this sort of, I don't know, Buddha type figure, right? That was just telling people to, I don't know, like love, man, or whatever, right? People have all these sorts of different understandings about Jesus. But as Christians, well, we would say that Jesus is the God man, right? He is God incarnate. And ultimately, his claim to be God incarnate, to be the Messiah, to be the one for whom history was made, by whom, through whom, and for whom all of creation was made, is ultimately vindicated by this feat of the resurrection, right? Of the fact that he was brutally murdered for our sins. He was put in a tomb, and yet 3 days later, he rose again, and that tomb was empty. And so, what is the basic sort of case you would give to a skeptic for why they should believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ? And again, this is not going to be, for anyone at home, this is not going to be like a beginning to end, all the evidence, just like an introductory sort of basic case. What would that be?
Yeah. So what I would do first is I would kind of catalog the most relevant facts, and I would show that they all point to the reality of the resurrection as the best possible explanation. Okay. So one of the types of explanation that exists is what's called abductive explanation. And that's reasoning to the best explanation for, a group of facts or a certain type of phenomenon that we need to explain. And I think that the resurrection, the thesis that Jesus rose from the dead, is certainly the best explanation of the available facts. But the other thing we need to do is we need to look at alternative theories. Obviously, there are other explanations that people have offered, and we need to look at those and see what we can say about them. What things count in their favor or what things count against them. And I think what we will see is that they actually have nothing to recommend them whatsoever. So the alternative theories are extremely weak. They're not credible. Only the theory or the thesis that Jesus rose from the dead makes sense of the facts that we have to deal with. So let's just quickly mention some of these facts. So we know that Jesus died and was buried in a tomb because everything in history points to that fact. Okay, the scriptures do, extra biblical evidence, post biblical evidence. It all points to the truth that Jesus died and was buried in a tomb. And then after a very short time, the tomb was empty. Even unbelieving Jews acknowledged that Jesus' tomb was empty because they claimed that his body was stolen by his disciples. So if the tomb was not empty, it could have simply been opened to dispel any rumors that Jesus had risen, but this was not done. Okay, so the tomb was not opened, the rumors were not dispelled, and so forth. The tomb also was guarded by highly trained soldiers, right? Professional Roman soldiers. These were very well-trained individuals. They were subject to severe penalties if they were negligent, if they didn't follow orders. They could expect to be killed if they had been negligent, if they had allowed somebody to interfere with or enter the tomb. So if the disciples stole the body, as the Jews opposed to Jesus claimed, then they would have had to find a way to get past these soldiers to enter the tomb. But as we know, all the disciples fled when Jesus was arrested, as you mentioned. Okay, so the chance that they would risk death to steal a body for no apparent reason is exceedingly unrealistic. Okay, there's no good motive for them to do that. The stationing of guards at the tomb, that suggests that no one could have entered or left the tomb except by supernatural means. So it seems clear that there was an empty tomb, and it seems like there's no natural explanation for that. So this fact by itself, just there being an empty tomb, that requires an explanation. And I think the empty tomb is by itself a significant problem for skeptics. Just explaining how the tomb got empty, if it's being guarded by a contingent of Roman soldiers, and there's nobody around that actually has an interest in entering the tomb or in removing the body from the tomb. Because, like I said, there's just no obvious or evident motive for that, for why the disciples would even have that as a goal or an aspiration. We also have to consider the issue of the appearances, of course. So we have the empty tomb where there's, Jesus's body is missing. And then we have the appearances, which confirm and corroborate the idea that the tomb was empty because of a supernatural act of God. So according to the Gospels, as you mentioned, Jesus was first seen by women. And you're right that this wouldn't have been said if the story was fabricated with the intent to deceive people. If you're trying to make up a story to fool or trick people, you're not going to say that women were the first ones to see the risen Jesus, because the testimony of women, that was not considered reliable in the first century. So no one would make up a miracle story about a crucified man coming back to life even harder to believe by suggesting that the story originated with a bunch of women. Okay, nobody would do that. There's also the issue of Jesus's brothers. Okay, so we have Jesus's brothers being skeptical of him during his lifetime. Okay, it seems very clear that they were not believers while he was alive, and that they only came to believe in him after his death. And if they were kind of embarrassed by him while he was alive, okay, if they were not close to him while he was alive, and certainly the crucifixion would have been pretty embarrassing for their family, I'm sure. It's impossible to think that they would have had this change of heart or this change of mind without something very remarkable causing it. So the fact that they became very serious and devout believers in Jesus after his crucifixion, I think that can only be explained by saying that they must have seen their brother after his crucifixion. He must have appeared to them. He must have spoke with them. He must have convinced them that he was the Messiah and that he had been raised. Another thing we can mention is that his disciples, as we've already talked about, they were so demoralized and so afraid of the authorities that they would have had no plausible motive for creating some kind of conspiracy to make up and publicize stories about Jesus. Okay, I'm sure when Jesus was crucified, I'm sure they wanted to just disappear. Okay, they didn't want to attract any attention whatsoever. So for them to suddenly be going around Judea and Galilee and telling people about Jesus and the fact that he was risen shortly after his death would make no sense unless something very extraordinary had actually happened. And then the most significant fact I think that needs to be accounted for, all these are important, all of them matter, but I think this one in particular just really is kind of the coup de grace, really. It's that all the historical sources that we have suggest that Jesus' disciples spent their entire lives after the crucifixion spreading news about his resurrection, telling people about his resurrection, and suffering continuous persecution and continuous hardship on account of that message. So it's impossible to think that any individual in their right mind would do such a thing for something that he knew was a lie. Okay, like I said, there's no material gain, there's no worldly benefit here. It doesn't make any sense for somebody to be subjecting themselves to this kind of treatment for something that they know is a lie, and they know that they do not have to be doing this. They don't have to be telling people about Jesus. They don't have to be speaking about the resurrection. They could just go home and return to their job as a fisherman or whatever. Okay, so that certainly was on the table. That certainly would have been a possibility. They could just go back to their old life and resume things as they had been before, and they could have just chalked this up to being kind of a foolish the foolishness of youth. I got kind of hoodwinked by this guy who said he was the Messiah, and then I was following him around for a while, and he was really had us all tricked, had us all thinking that he was God's son, and then he got crucified, and that was the end of the story. Okay, that would have made sense if there had been no resurrection. That's the only thing that really would have made sense, if there had been no resurrection. But what we see is something very different. They're not going back to their old vocations. They're doing something different. Okay, they're all engaged now in missionary work. They're all going around and speaking to people about Jesus and attracting unwanted attention or unwelcome attention, in the sense that the authorities and the unbelieving Jews are trying to make life difficult for them because of the message that they have. So this like I said, it would be unthinkable if we just had an individual doing this. That itself would be extremely strange. But we have a large group of people doing this. We have the disciples, and that's not just the 12, but it's many others that had followed Jesus and had witnessed the resurrection. They're all engaged in this kind of witnessing, and they're all doing it even though it's putting them in danger, and even though they're having to face these negative consequences. And this goes against every law of human psychology. If they were just making it up, or if they knew it was a lie, it would go against every law of human psychology. It wouldn't make sense whatsoever. There's no case in human history where you have hundreds of people joining together for several decades to promote something they know is false in the face of severe persecution for no material or temporal benefit. So I think that this itself is entirely sufficient to prove the truth of the resurrection. Just the behavior of the disciples and Jesus's followers after the fact. We also, we should mention that there's no testimony or evidence or any sign that the disciples were involved in any sort of plot. So it wasn't like somebody connected to the early church ended up coming forward and claiming that the resurrection was fabricated, or the disciples were insincere, or there was some kind of plot at work. There was no whistleblower. Okay, nobody came forward to reveal the disciples' dirty secrets. Okay, it never happened. So the evidence clearly, all of it, to truth that Jesus rose from the dead. Any alternative theory, if it's going to be acceptable, it's going to have to do a better job of explaining these facts than the thesis that Jesus rose. So the next thing to do, of course, is to look at these alternative theories and to evaluate them. So one of them is called the swoon theory. This is one that doesn't get utilized that much anymore because it's so obviously a bad explanation. But what it involves is basically the claim that Jesus appeared dead on the cross, and then he was taken down and he was placed in the tomb. And then once he was in the tomb, he revived, and then he was somehow able to get out of the tomb, and then he appeared to his disciples. So he didn't really die. He just looked dead. He was put in the tomb, and then he woke up or came to life, came back to his senses, or had enough vitality at least to get out of the tomb. Okay. The problems with this theory are extremely numerous and serious. So for one thing, Roman soldiers knew how to do their jobs. As we just mentioned, they were very professional. They were exceptionally proficient at killing people. They would have made sure beyond any reasonable doubt that Jesus was dead before taking him off the cross. And they knew how to determine if somebody was dead. So it's clear that the soldiers would have done their jobs. It's also highly unlikely that even if he were still alive, just for the sake of argument, if we're willing to grant the possibility that he was still alive, then we have to think about him being put in the tomb without any kind of medical attention. And somehow he's supposed to revive. Somehow he's supposed to, recuperate or heal enough that he's able to get out of the tomb without further problem. And then we have to deal with him exiting the tomb. So he gets put in the tomb. His health is, very poor. He has suffered terribly. He has terrible wounds. And somehow he's able to survive that. Somehow he's able to get up, and he's able to, approach the entrance of the tomb. Well, how does he get past the guards? How does he get past these Roman soldiers without incident? It's short of employing miracles, which this theory, of course, is designed to exclude. This appears impossible. Okay, he's in this tomb. He's locked in this tomb. How does he get out from the inside when it's being guarded by a contingent of soldiers? Okay, so if we're willing to grant all that, though, if we're willing to grant that somehow he survived the cross, he was placed in the tomb, he survived being alone in the tomb, his wounds did not kill him in the tomb, and then he was able to exit the tomb somehow and get past the Roman guards. Now he has to appear to his disciples. Okay. And he obviously would have been in a grievous state. He would have been terribly injured, terribly weakened, and this would not have been an appearance that would have inspired confidence. Okay, if you're Jesus's disciples and Jesus appears to you and it looks like he just got crucified and it doesn't look like he's received any medical attention or any medical help, you're probably going to be panicking. Okay, you're going to be extremely concerned and extremely scared and unsure probably of what to do. Okay, so you're not going to be convinced that he has risen from the dead. Okay, you're going to be, like I said, very, very worried about what's going on and about what you should do probably in that situation. Okay, the body that Jesus has, or the appearance that he has in the scriptures, is totally different from this. Okay, even though he still bears the signs of his crucifixion, it's clear that he is not in a state which requires medical attention. It's clear that he's not in a state that would lead the disciples to be concerned about his well-being or his safety. Okay, so what the disciples saw sounds nothing like what they would have seen if the swoon theory were correct. And another problem is that let's say the disciples see Jesus and somehow they believe he came back from the dead, even though it looks like he's still almost dead. Okay, so they believe he came back from the dead. Well, and then Jesus presumably continues to heal, continues to convalesce, and then he goes on and does other things, right? Well, there's no record of any of these things, right? There's no sign that there was ever, things that happened after he was raised other than the appearances themselves, okay? But if Jesus had simply recuperated, then presumably he would have continued his ministry or would have done something else, and there would be some kind of record of that. He would have eventually died a natural death, presumably, right? Once again, there's no record of that. There's nothing about that anywhere. So this theory has nothing to recommend it. It can't account for any of the facts. Nothing that it has to appeal to is reasonable. Nothing makes sense. If anything is clear in history, it's that Jesus really died on the cross. And that has to be true for any of the other things to make sense that we've been talking about. For, his getting out of the tomb, for the reaction of the disciples, for the subsequent history. That only makes sense if Jesus died and then there was a real resurrection. So another theory that we can talk about is just the traditional Jewish claim that the disciples stole the body. Okay, as we've already mentioned, the disciples would have no motive to do this. It would serve no purpose. Just having a body on your hands, what would be the point of that? How could that benefit them? All it would do is get them in trouble. All right, all it would do is subject them to getting killed by the Roman authorities, which is something that they obviously didn't want to experience, which is why they ran away when Jesus was arrested, right? Which is why they were trying to lay low and trying to stay out of sight of the authorities. It's also true that even more evidently, they would have had no motive to spend the rest of their lives telling people about the resurrection, something that they knew never happened because they had stolen the body. Okay, and like I said earlier, they suffered great persecution and often even death for their witness. So it's highly likely that any pointless plot would have fallen apart. Okay, if there was a pointless plot that had no real goal or end in sight in terms of temporal or worldly benefits, that would have fallen apart, and somebody would have, confessed that it was false and that it was fabricated. So another theory is that the disciples were just hallucinating. This one is probably the one that is most attractive, I think, to skeptics, because they'll want to say that the disciples were sincere. The disciples really believed they saw Jesus, but they didn't, because they were just hallucinating. Okay, they were just seeing things. They were, distraught. They were emotionally unstable, and in those circumstances, they believed that Jesus was appearing to them, or they believed that they had seen Jesus, even though he had not. Now, like I said, this is probably the one that's the most reasonable. And if Jesus had only appeared to one disciple, this would maybe be a convincing objection. Okay, this would maybe be a sufficient objection to the theory that he was raised. if there had only been one disciple who had claimed to see him. But because of the number of people involved and the character of the appearances and the fact that the tomb was empty, this is not able to account for what it needs to account for. Okay, it's impossible to think that all of these people hallucinated or were just seeing things, because Jesus appeared to a large number of them, and he appeared to them more than once, and he appeared to them all at the same time. It's also reported that the disciples not only saw him, but they touched him, they spoke with him on multiple occasions. And this is inconsistent with what happens during a mass hallucination or a group hallucination. Okay, there are events, there are times in history where many people have been gathered together and they have experienced hallucinations. But these hallucinations, they don't involve multiple people having identical experiences. They don't involve multiple people seeing the same sights, hearing the same words. They don't involve multiple senses being affected in multiple people in the same ways at the same time. And if that did happen, that itself would have no natural explanation. Okay, you have hundreds of people seeing the same thing, hearing the same thing, and there's no, and it's a hallucination, then how on earth is that possible? How on earth could that be happening if there's nothing objective for them to be seeing or hearing? So this would have to be, this kind of explanation would end up having to be as supernatural as the experience that it's trying to account for. Okay, it itself would require something miraculous for all of these people to have the same sights and hear the same sounds without anything objective being present. Okay, it doesn't make sense. It's unreasonable to think that actually could have possibly happened. So in this case, we would have to evoke something nearly miraculous, or something that is, simply unfathomable, something that makes no sense, to explain away a miracle. And so that would not succeed in serving the purpose of the skeptic. Even if it were plausible to say that the disciples were imagining things due to wishful thinking, it certainly wouldn't be true to say that of the Apostle Paul. Okay, so Paul is an interesting example, just because he was certainly not engaged in wishful thinking when he experienced the risen Jesus. So before his conversion, of course, he was a persecutor of the church. He had no interest in seeing the risen Jesus. I'm sure he didn't believe there was a risen Jesus to experience. I'm sure he thought that all of the tales of Jesus's resurrection were false. And yet he became as convinced as anyone that Jesus was risen. So we can't appeal to his psychological state for why he had a vision of Jesus. Okay, we can't say he hallucinated because he was just so distraught about Jesus's death. And that, like I said, that just confirms what we've already talked about. It's clear that the disciples did not have a mass hallucination. Okay, what they saw, because it appealed to multiple senses or affected multiple senses, and because they all were experiencing the same thing at the same time, there had to be something objective that they were seeing. It couldn't have just been in their minds. It couldn't have just been something subjective. Another theory is that Jesus's body was never actually placed in the tomb. John Dominic Crossan, who was a member of the Jesus Seminar, a liberal, I think one time he was a Roman Catholic priest, and then I think he left the priesthood, but a liberal Jesus scholar. His claim was that Jesus never actually got put in the tomb, that he was just thrown in a ditch somewhere and his body was eaten by wild animals. But there's no evidence that would support this idea. Okay, this is very close to the mythicism that we were talking about, because there's just nothing there that would lend support to it. Nowhere in Scripture is it ever suggested or alluded to that Jesus was placed anywhere other than a tomb. And even the Jewish opponents of the early Christians conceded that his body had been entombed. They said that the disciples had stolen the body out of the tomb. So like the theory that the disciples stole the body, this theory that he was never even put in the tomb can't account for any of the subsequent history. Okay, it can't account for the courage, the dedication of the disciples. It can't account for their work in spreading the message that Jesus was raised. So once again, because this idea is not supported by anything factual and can't make sense of the things that occurred after the resurrection, this has nothing to recommend it. So the last thing I'll mention, last theory, is one that you sometimes come across in liberal theology, and that is that what happened after the crucifixion is that the disciples were like gathered together and they were reminiscing about Jesus and talking about how much he meant to them. And they decided that what really mattered was that Jesus's teachings live on, okay, particularly his ethical teachings or his moral teachings. Okay, they were so impressed by these teachings that they decided that, you know, the story of Jesus couldn't end with the crucifixion, and they needed to carry it on. Okay, this is something that you would see. This is a perspective that one might see like in late 19th century, early 20th century liberal theology. And the idea is that the resurrection is like a symbol of the continuing significance of Jesus's teachings. So what inspired the disciples to spread the Christian message was not seeing Jesus alive after the crucifixion, but just his extraordinary goodness and his moral authority, his insight into moral truths. But this theory, like all the others, it runs into very significant problems. So probably the most important to mention is that the early apostolic preaching that you see in the book of Acts and in Paul's letters and so forth, that was not centered on Jesus's moral teachings. Okay? His ethics was not what they were proclaiming. It was focused on his death and resurrection. And so this would be very strange if what inspired his disciples to carry on his message was the moral teachings. The moral teachings inspired the resurrection symbolism, that you would think that they would be proclaiming the moral teachings and not the resurrection. So this makes very little sense. It seems very clear that his disciples thought it was his person and his works that were the most unique and the most significant. It wasn't his moral teaching. And if this is true, then some kind of vindication of his person would have been necessary following his crucifixion. Okay, something would have had to happen to show that he actually had the authority and actually was had the role or the calling that they believed he had, that he was Israel's Messiah. Without a vindication through the resurrection, the disciples would no doubt have lost hope that he was who they thought he was. And like I said earlier, they would have just returned to their boats, returned to their nets, and gotten back to life as normal. But since that didn't happen, something extraordinary had to have happened. So this idea that he was just an impressive teacher, this does nothing to account for the early Christian preaching, the early Christian mission. All it does maybe is explain why the disciples continue to have some interest in him, but it doesn't deal with any of the other facts that we've been talking about. Empty tomb, the appearances, the missionary work, all of that stuff, it doesn't explain. So those, I think, are the most common alternative theories for what happened after Jesus's death. And like I said, I think the one that probably sounds the most reasonable is the hallucination theory. But like I said, there are really good reasons to think that's not capable of accounting for all the facts that need to be accounted for. I think that itself would require a miracle, would require something supernatural. So I think the only explanation that really makes sense is the explanation that we find in Scripture, that Jesus was raised, he appeared to many people, and because many people were convinced that he was raised, they lived out their lives preaching about him and about the salvation that is found in him. So Christians should have a lot of confidence that Jesus is alive. They should have a lot of confidence that he was in truth and in fact raised, and that they will see him again. He is alive right now. He is reigning right now. He is, present right now in the church and in believers, and we will see him in the flesh someday.
Why should someone want all of what you just said to be true? Why should, let's say we have an atheist watching this, why should they want Christianity to be true? So we've been making the case this whole time, right? Like Christianity is in fact true, right? You gave an argument for God's existence. We've talked a little bit about why it's reasonable to believe in the existence of Jesus, in the resurrection. But simply arguing that something is the case is a little bit different from arguing that someone should want to accept that that thing is actually the case. So why should someone want Christianity to be true? What does Christianity offer that atheism does not?
Right. Yeah, and I think that that's the main reason why we have atheists, is because there are people that don't want it to be true. Okay, it's not because the evidence is not sufficient. It's not because the facts are unclear. It's because people don't want it to be true, and so they look for reasons to doubt or reasons to object. What I would say is that Christianity offers everything that is necessary to make life fulfilling. I think if you have a proper understanding of human nature or the human condition, that you will see that Christianity provides what we need to have a satisfying life. Christianity gives us hope for the future. We already mentioned that's something that people need. They need hope for the future. It promises the righting of all wrongs eventually. That's something we also talked about when we were talking about the problem of evil. Christianity promises that all injustices will be dealt with. Christianity also promises the renewal of relationships that are interrupted by death. So anybody who has loved ones that they can't bear the thought of being forever separated from, Christianity certainly offers a good reason to believe it, just for that reason alone, that you will get to see your loved ones again. Christianity gives meaning and purpose in this life. So it's not just all about pie in the sky. It's not just all about heavenly rewards. It promises purpose in this life. It gives us lots of important things to do. It gives us mission. It gives us vocation. We get to serve God and others every day. Everything that we do matters. So that's really important, especially in the modern world, where so many people seem to go through life without meaning and purpose, right? Because they don't believe in Christianity and they don't believe in any other, traditional religion or historical religion. A lot of people feel lost, and they don't know what they're doing with themselves. This was an experience I had when I was in my 20s. I was, like I said, I had left the church for a while, and I was trying to figure out, like, what am I doing with myself? What I still have probably a significant amount of time left in my life. What am I going to do with it? I needed purpose, which I lacked. And so that's why I initially started looking at Christianity again, was because I knew that Christianity could provide that. I wasn't sure it was true, but I knew that was something that it promised, and that was something that I really wanted. Another thing that Christianity does is it promotes the pursuit of truth. Okay, Christians care about truth. Christians want people to be sincere and honest and to seek the facts of things. It promotes virtue, promotes morality. I think we all would prefer to be around virtuous people than to be around vicious people. Okay, so virtue is a good thing. Christianity promotes community. We're social creatures. We want to belong. We want to fellowship with others. Christianity provides that, and a lot of people lack that today. A lot of people stopped going to church, and maybe they had the hope that they would find community elsewhere, but very few people have found that, or they go online looking for it, but it's like a pale reflection, or an inadequate substitute for what the church used to provide. Christianity also provides beauty. So we all, being human, we need beauty, we long for beauty. And Christianity is full of beauty. It's full of beautiful teachings, beautiful music, beautiful art, beautiful architecture. So there's nothing, no human need that we have that Christianity doesn't address. It provides an intellectually interesting and satisfying understanding of reality. If you are somebody who is attracted to the life of the mind, if you are attracted to books, if you're attracted to ideas, you will find an abundance of things to feast upon in Christianity. You'll find more than you could ever absorb in one lifetime. You will never be bored, ever. Like I said, regardless of the kind of person you are, regardless of what you think of as being your needs, they will be met by Christianity in one way or another. There's a reason why people sometimes object that Christianity sounds too good to be true. They'll be like, yeah, I don't believe this precisely because it does seem to provide all these things, right? It provides so much hope, and it provides so much comfort and so much peace and so much joy. And I just don't think that's how the world is. People will raise this as an objection, that it's too good to be true. And what that tells us is that there really are no drawbacks to Christianity. If it's rightly understood and rightly practiced, there are no drawbacks. Obviously, there are Christians that fall short. There are Christians that sin. There are churches that do the wrong thing. I'm not saying that Christians are perfect by any means. I'm not even saying that the Christian tradition is perfect. Obviously, there are things in our history that are problematic and that we shouldn't be proud of. But Christianity at its best, rightly understood, rightly practiced, there are no drawbacks. There's nothing there that deserves criticism or warrants criticism. If we're going to look at atheism, on the other hand, then we see something very different. And you've already touched upon this earlier this morning, but you see a very, very different picture. So atheism, I don't think, really offers anything besides the appearance of autonomy, right? Self-government, self-rule, and that's very attractive for people. Unfortunately, sadly, that's enough to make it appealing to some people, because they don't like, or they can't stand the idea that they're accountable to someone. They can't stand the idea that their life is not in their hands. They can't stand the idea that they have a God-given purpose that they need to conform to. Right? They want to think that all of this is up to them. But autonomy, as appealing as it is to some people, it's not a genuine need or a good that human beings have. Okay, it's a result. The fact that it's so attractive to us is just due to our sinfulness. It's not something natural to us. And the pursuit of it only leads to misery. Wanting to be autonomous, wanting to rule ourselves, wanting to be independent, that just leads to misery. And we see that all around us in the world today. The longing for autonomy that we've seen throughout the modern world, after the Enlightenment in particular, that has left us with a culture and a society that is in decay, that's corrupt, that's falling apart. Things are disintegrating all around us, and that's because we want to do things on our own terms. We want to do things our way instead of God's way, and we're reaping the consequences of that. We're experiencing what necessarily follows when human beings pursue autonomy at the cost of everything else. So Christianity, like I was saying, it grants abundant hope for the future, but atheism just promises continuing injustice, right? More injustice, more death, more desolation. We talked about that when dealing with the problem of evil. Christianity promises meaning and purpose. Atheism just says you have to do without purpose, or you have to create your own purpose. There's no ultimate or objective meanings. Everything is subjective. Nietzsche, he was the most famous proponent of this way of thinking. You have to chart your own course. You have to create your own values. You have to define your own existence. But many people in the modern world, they do the same thing. They think the same way. They think that they have to create their own meaning, but the problem is you can't create your own meaning. Any meaning that you can just change at a whim, that's not meaning. It's not a real purpose. So you can have a goal, but if it's not something that is given to you as a gift from outside of yourself, if it's not something objective, then it's not going to provide any kind of satisfaction or fulfillment. All it is going to be a form of self-assertion, really, and that can't provide what we need. So another difference, Christianity, I think you could say it encourages the pursuit of great and excellent things. Christianity inspires excellence, and it inspires us to want to perfect ourselves to whatever extent we can, because we believe that is what God wants for human beings. He wants them to fulfill their potential. In all of the different realms and areas of life, God wants us to do our best. And so Christianity encourages that. But I think atheism just breeds apathy. It just breeds anxiety. It breeds laziness. It causes people to basically shut down and stop exploring and stop trying, because they just say, what's the point trying hard? Christianity, like I was saying a moment ago, it provides so much intellectual stimulation in so many areas, right? I mean, modern science, as much as people talk about how science and religion are opposed, Modern science exists because of Christianity, right? It exists because of the stimulation that Christianity provided to thinkers. That people, wanted to understand God's world, and they assumed that because God created it, it must be intelligible, right? And that was why we have science in the West. That is why the West invented science as we know it. It was because of these Christian beliefs that motivated scientists to inquire into the workings of nature. If we just had atheism, if people had always been atheists, there would be no science. I'm quite confident about that, because people would not see any point. The assumption would be that the universe is absurd, the universe is unintelligible, it doesn't ultimately make sense. And so what is the point of engaging in scientific inquiry? So Christianity is a natural fit for that kind of thing, a natural home for that kind of thing. Atheism is not. Atheism gives us a universe that's mired in absurdity. So I don't think there's a single spiritual need that atheism is able to meet, not one. And because of that, there's no good reason to be an atheist. We've talked about some of the facts that support Christianity, the arguments that support Christianity. But if we're just looking at the question of what is going to benefit us most, what is going to give us the best life, I think it's clear that Christianity wins far and away. Here there's not even really any debate to be had. Okay, there might be a debate about some of these intellectual issues or these theoretical issues, but when it comes to which one promises the best kind of life, which one promises the best existence here on earth, not to mention heaven, I think it's clear that Christianity is vastly superior to atheism. So if someone is willing to grant that the atheist picture is bleak, which I think they should, but they refuse to consider theism, they refuse to entertain the possibility that it's true, then I just think that a person like that would be being highly, they would be highly irrational. That just wouldn't make any sense to think that way. One thing I think is helpful here is an argument called Pascal's wager. So Pascal was a French Catholic thinker who lived in the 17th century, and he was a brilliant scientist and a brilliant apologist. And he says that through belief we have everything to gain and nothing to lose, basically, and through unbelief we have nothing to gain. And I think that's true. So I think theistic religion clearly offers far more than atheism for the reasons we've just mentioned. And I think of the theistic religions, Christianity is the most well supported by the evidence. So we should be Christians. Nothing else really makes sense. Nothing else is rational. Christianity offers everything we could ever want, and it's also much better supported. The truth of it is much better supported than any other religion. Like the case that we were talking about for the resurrection, there's nothing like that in any other religion regarding its founder. We're not going to find anything else that's vouching for the truthfulness or for the significance of that religion's founder like the evidence that supports the resurrection. There's nothing like that for Buddha. There's nothing like that for Muhammad. Only Christ has this historical event that is so well supported and so well attested to by the facts. So when it comes to evidence, if we have, basically the point that I'm making here is we should choose religion. We should choose some kind of a spiritual perspective on the universe and on life, because that has a lot more to offer than a materialistic or an atheistic perspective. And then once we have understood that much, then we should also be able to see that Christianity is much more likely to be true than any other religion. And so for that reason, if we want to be rational people, reasonable people, wise people, it only makes sense to be a Christian.
As we come here to the end, right, we've talked about an argument for God's existence, arguments for the resurrection, why someone should want to be a Christian. But so let's say that someone gets to this place and they say, okay, fine, yes, I want to be a Christian. That sounds lovely and wonderful. And so I guess perhaps as C.S. Lewis might say, right, they walk into this sort of hallway of Christianity, and there's all these different rooms, right? There's different traditions. You have Roman Catholics, you have Eastern Orthodox, you have the Reformed, you have Anglicanism, you have Lutheranism, you have a whole bunch of different flavors of modern evangelicalism. And yet, when you found yourself with that same in that same sort of hallway, you chose Lutheranism. or rather we would say that looking at all these different options where you found yourself, right, where the Lord kind of drew you to, was to Lutheranism. And so as a confessional Lutheran, why should an atheist become a Lutheran as opposed to some other kind of Christian? What is it that makes Lutheranism unique?
Okay. Well, I'll just give you the reason for why I myself find it compelling. I was definitely attracted to, you could say, like the external features or qualities of Lutheranism in terms of the liturgy and in terms of like its historical rootedness. Those things were important to me. But of course, the most important thing is, is it true? Right? That's the decisive question, or the thing that should most matter to us is it true, and is it based on the Bible? Right? Because you can have a tradition that's very attractive in terms of its artwork or its architecture or its music, or how long it claims to have been around. Though, because I've always been drawn to older things and things that are like more historical, right? So that's for me, that's something that's like inherently compelling when a church can claim that it's an old church that's been around for a while, that it has a lot of rich traditions. That's something that appeals to me. But what really matters is if it's true, because obviously there are a lot of churches, or at least a few major ones, that claim to have lots of things going for it in terms of these external things, in terms of the appearance that it has, or in terms of the traditions that it has. But the question that we have to ask, like I said, is it true? That's really the most important thing. And debates between Christian traditions, unfortunately, they tend to be interminable, in the sense that they go on forever, because every tradition has significant problems in the eyes of other traditions. So all traditions have their talking points. All traditions have their like standard rebuttals to the things that other traditions say. And this has been going on obviously for hundreds of years, right? Every Christian church will give you the list of reasons for why you should belong to their church, and the list of reasons for why you should avoid other churches, or why you shouldn't belong to those churches. I think an impartial evaluation of the evidence would lead a person to the conclusion that Lutheranism is true, unsurprisingly, right? That's why I'm Lutheran. But I'm certainly not surprised that there are many other people who feel differently, because nobody is totally impartial. Everybody has their biases. Everybody has their preconceptions. I think Lutheranism tends to get overlooked in the conversation about church belonging or church membership, because it is a relatively small tradition compared to some of the others. And it's not necessarily well understood outside of Lutheran churches and Lutheran contexts. One thing we need to work on in the future, I think, is just making our ideas accessible, and making others know and understand where we're coming from, and why we think the way that we do. We haven't had the best PR, or we haven't had the best publicity over the last few hundred years, especially in the United States. We've kind of existed in our own enclave, and we haven't necessarily engaged or dialogued much with other Christian traditions. I think that is changing to some extent, which is good. I think, more people are realizing that we're part of the picture, that we're on the landscape, and that they should think of us as an option, or they should consider us, which is good, because obviously when people are not even aware that you exist, they're not even going to think about you. And I think a lot of people like that, make the transition or move from like non-denominational Christianity to Catholicism or Orthodoxy. They don't even think about Lutheranism, because it's not on their radar. And I think that we're doing better at promoting ourselves, and we're doing a better job of becoming, a player in that conversation, somebody that people should look at, a tradition that people should look at, and a tradition that people should consider before they, make a move, a permanent move to somewhere else. But what I would say about what makes Lutheranism unique, and what I think makes it truthful, as opposed to simply attractive, is that it combines a Reformation understanding of authority and salvation with a Catholic understanding of the sacraments. So this combination, in my view, it's what the scriptures teach. It's in accord with the scriptures. And I don't think that there's any other tradition that combines these things in quite the same way. So when I say a Reformation understanding of authority, what I mean is sola scriptura. I mean adherence to sola scriptura, which is often caricatured and misunderstood, but that's just the view that the Bible is the source of all articles of the faith, and it's the only infallible authority in the church. So it's not the view that it's the only authority. It's not the view that other traditions and other authorities don't matter, but it is the only infallible authority. So it does get the last word when it comes to our doctrine. And when I say a Reformation understanding of salvation, I mean the view that salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. Okay, so sola gratia, sola fide, solus Christus. Okay, so Christ is an all-sufficient Savior, and we receive justification, sanctification, and our future glorification through faith in him, through faith alone in him. So that's what I mean by a Reformation understanding of salvation. And then when I talk about a Catholic view of the sacraments, what I mean by that is that Lutherans believe that the sacraments are means of grace that actually grant salvation. So Christ is actually present to us in these means, and we are united to him through baptism and through the Lord's Supper. And it's in and through that union that we receive all of his benefits. So the sacraments are efficacious. They actually do something. They play a role in bringing us to heaven. And I think that's something that the church has always taught. And I think it's true. And I think it's based in scripture. So Lutheranism combines these things in a more consistent and committed way than I think any other tradition does. Anglicanism, is rather similar to Lutheranism in some ways, but I just think that we are more, our understanding of these things is more consistent, and we're more devoted to these doctrines than you will typically find in Anglicanism. So I think no other tradition combines these elements in quite the same way. Nobody else combines them in a way that is as consistent with what Scripture teaches. Like I said, I think all these views are biblical. I think that Scripture does teach a Reformation understanding of authority, which isn't to say that understanding originated with the Reformation, because I think you will find the Church Fathers and you'll find earlier Christians affirming a teaching that is basically in accord with sola scriptura. So I don't think that's just a novelty of the Reformation, but I'm calling it that because that was when it was, first, explicitly formulated in the way that it was at that time. So a Reformation understanding of authority, Reformation understanding of salvation, Catholic understanding of the sacraments. It's in combining those things in the way that Lutheranism does that I think it expresses its essence, or it expresses its true nature. And it shows its beauty, it shows its truth, its goodness, it shows its foundation in Scripture. So every tradition has their exegetes that are going to defend their own doctrinal stance and claim to find it in the Bible. But I think if someone was to give a careful consideration to what the Scriptures teach, they would find that the Scriptures do support this Lutheran synthesis that I've been discussing. So all we can really do is just invite people to investigate this for themselves. There's no eat simple or knockdown argument for being Lutheran, because it does involve a lot of searching through the Scriptures and thinking carefully about what other traditions teach and whose perspective is best supported by what the Bible says. But it is something that I think everybody should invest the time in doing. Everybody should make sure that the church they go to is grounded on the Scriptures. They should make sure that the doctrines they affirm are taught in the Bible. And I think that, if you engage in this search in the right way, with a heart that is set on finding the truth, and you're open to changing your mind, I think that it's quite possible that you'll end up where I have, and you will believe that these things that I've just been talking about are what is taught in the Scriptures, and that Lutheranism is the best expression of them. So it can be a long process, but it's definitely worth it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greeley, for joining us today.
Sure.
one more time for everybody at home, if you guys want to go ahead and check out Dr. Greeley's book, providing an introduction to Christian apologetics. It is titled Christian Apologetics, A Lutheran Introduction. I'll make sure to include it down below, either in the description or in a pinned comment. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Dr. Greeley, before we head out?
No, just thanks for having me. It's been enjoyable, and I appreciate your comments. I appreciate the things that you added, and God has given us what we need to know the truth when it comes to religious and spiritual questions. And so if we diligently search for answers, we will find them. That's my last word.
All right. With that, thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you again in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.